Hey everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know a lot of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we start, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you from and what time is it there? Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and just relax. The woman in the hallway. During a time in my life when I was living completely on my own, I found myself in a small one-bedroom apartment tucked into the downstairs portion of someone else's house. I had just moved out of my parents' place and hadn't yet met the woman who would become my girlfriend. Those days were filled with solitude, broken only by my time at school and work, leaving me with countless hours to fill in that quiet apartment. Movies became my constant companion, particularly horror films that would leave me slightly unsettled as I tried to fall asleep in the darkness of my bedroom. Even though I was 21 years old at the time, those scary movies still had a way of getting under my skin, especially when I was lying there alone in bed. After watching something particularly frightening, I would find myself scanning the shadows in my room, sometimes even reaching over to switch on the bedside lamp just to reassure myself that nothing was lurking in the corners. On this particular night, I knew the tenant who lived upstairs was away because his car wasn't parked in its usual spot in the driveway. This meant that any sounds I was hearing couldn't possibly be footsteps from above, which made the noises even more unsettling. My nerves were really beginning to get the better of me as I continued to hear these unexplained sounds that seemed to be coming from somewhere within the house, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Finally, I gathered enough courage to get up and make my way to the bedroom door, pulling it open to peer into the darkness beyond. The layout of my apartment was simple, with a narrow hallway directly outside my bedroom that led to a bathroom door and then opened up into the living room at the far end. What I saw at the end of that hallway was something straight out of the horror movie I had watched barely an hour before. There was a woman standing perfectly still at the far end of the corridor, positioned right by the entrance to the kitchen. The moonlight filtering through the bedroom windows and the living room windows provided just enough illumination for me to see her clearly, and she was staring directly back at me. Then she began to move backward while keeping her eyes locked on mine, never turning away. Terror overtook any rational thought I might have had, and I screamed while stumbling backward into my room, slamming the door shut and turning the lock as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. Instead of hearing her rush toward my door or pound on it as I expected, I heard rapid footsteps running up the half flight of stairs that led to my apartment's exit, followed by the thunderous slam of the door. I remained frozen in absolute shock for at least 10 minutes before I felt safe enough to grab my phone and venture out of the bedroom to check the rest of the apartment. It didn't take long to search the small space since there weren't many places where someone could hide, and I confirmed that I was once again alone. I rushed to lock the main door, my mind racing with questions about who that woman could have been and how she had gotten inside. For reasons I still can't explain, I didn't call the police that night. The next day, however, I did contact my landlord to tell him about the terrifying encounter. He made a phone call to the upstairs tenant, and what I learned from that conversation shocked me to my core. The woman who had broken into my apartment was actually the ex-lover of the man who lived upstairs, and apparently she had a history of unstable behavior. After somehow discovering his address, she had broken into the wrong part of the house, ending up in my apartment instead of his. The upstairs tenant came down to apologize to me the following day, but neither he nor the landlord provided many details about the situation. To this day, I still find myself wondering what exactly that woman had been planning to do to him that night. The girlfriend's true colors. From the very beginning, I've had nothing but bad feelings about my father's girlfriend, and her name is Kathy. My dad has been alone since we lost our mother back in 2019, and I understand that the loneliness has been eating away at him. The problem is that he seems so desperate for companionship that he's willing to settle for anyone, even someone like Kathy, and no matter how many warnings I give him, he refuses to listen to my concerns. I've been noticing her doing increasingly suspicious things around our house, and these observations are really starting to frighten me now. Let me explain everything from the beginning so you can understand why I'm so worried. In our family, there's me, my 10-year-old brother Jake, and my 2-year-old brother Scotty, and we've been trying to adjust to life without our mother. From the very first day my father introduced Kathy to us, something about her smile made me deeply uncomfortable. It was unnaturally wide and exaggerated, like she was trying too hard to appear friendly and warm. As time went on, my father began bringing her around more frequently, and while I never grew to like her, initially my discomfort was just based on a feeling that something was off about her personality. Then the strange incidents began to happen. She's been staying with us for several weeks now, and not long ago, I caught her in my father's closet while he was at work. That's where he keeps his safe, along with the paper where he's written the combination and several other valuable items. When she noticed me standing in the doorway watching her, she flashed that disturbing smile of hers and said in a sickeningly sweet voice, "Hey, what's up, sweetie?" I didn't engage with her beyond muttering, "Nothing," before she closed the closet door and I retreated to my room. When I told my father about this incident, he didn't seem the least bit concerned. A few days after that, while my father was at work again, I had just returned home from school and was heading upstairs to my room. As I climbed the stairs, I saw Kathy emerging from my little brother Jake's room, carefully closing the door behind her. When I asked what she had been doing in his room, she smiled that creepy smile again and explained that she was just opening the window because the house felt too warm. I didn't respond and continued up to my room, but once I heard her go downstairs, I couldn't resist sneaking over to Jake's room to verify her story. Both windows were completely shut, confirming my suspicions that she had lied to me. Something was definitely wrong with this woman, and I knew it in my bones. When I brought this incident to my father's attention, his only response was to ask me to please be patient with the situation, acknowledging that he knew I didn't care for Kathy but dismissing my concerns nonetheless. Fast forward to just 2 days ago when Jake, my father, and I were all out of the house, leaving Kathy alone to babysit little Scotty. I came home earlier than expected but decided to enter the house quietly because I wanted to see if I could catch her doing something suspicious again. I snuck through the front door and made my way to my room as silently as possible, trying not to alert her to my presence. Eventually, from the kitchen downstairs, I began to hear Scotty crying, but this wasn't his normal crying. This was the kind of distressed, panicked crying that immediately sets off alarm bells in any sibling's mind. Then I heard Kathy screaming at the top of her lungs, telling my baby brother to shut the F up, with such venom in her voice that it made my blood run cold. It was the first time I had ever heard her raise her voice, and I believe it was the first time I was witnessing her true nature emerge from behind that fake smile. I ran downstairs immediately to confront her and protect my brother, yelling at her to leave him alone. She was visibly startled and shocked to discover I was home, and for the first time since I'd known her, that creepy smile was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she just stared at me with a blank expression before turning and going downstairs to the basement, shutting the door behind her without saying a word. I called my father immediately to report what had happened, and that night he had a conversation with her about the incident. I don't know exactly how their discussion went, but I assume it didn't go well because that very night, something even more terrifying occurred. I woke up in the middle of the night with the distinct feeling that something was wrong, and when I opened my eyes and looked around my room, I could see someone standing there in the darkness. The figure quickly left the room and shut the door behind them before I could fully process what was happening. I jumped out of bed and opened my door, just in time to see and hear my father's bedroom door closing down the hall. I marched over to my father's room and opened the door to find both Kathy and my dad lying in bed as if nothing had happened. I woke my father up frantically and told him that Kathy had just been in my room, but she denied everything, claiming she had been in bed the entire time. I don't know whether my father believed me or not, but he told me to go back to my room and said he would talk with Kathy about it. I did as he asked, and as I closed the door, I could hear them whispering to each other in hushed tones. I went back to bed absolutely terrified, and I'm still scared now. I desperately want her out of our house and out of our lives because I truly believe she's dangerous. Why was she in my room in the middle of the night? The thought of it makes my skin crawl, and I'm genuinely worried for my family's safety. I don't know what we can do to protect ourselves from her. The Florida Stalker. This incident takes me back several years to when I was 30 years old, living in my condo in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The condo, which I still own today, sits on the second floor of a reasonably nice building that I won't identify for privacy reasons. Whenever I make the trip down there, it's usually during the colder months up north, and I transform into a complete beach enthusiast during my stays. I'm fortunate that my job allows me to work remotely through my laptop and phone, which gives me the freedom to escape to Florida whenever the mood strikes. Fort Lauderdale is generally a clean and safe city, and the specific area where my building is located is typically no exception to that rule. However, on this particular night in the middle of January, I would discover that even safe neighborhoods can harbor danger. It was late, well past 10 o'clock, and I was relaxing on my balcony with my feet propped up on the railing, working on my laptop and enjoying the warm evening air. Suddenly, from the ground below, I heard someone yelling what sounded like, "Yo!" and "Hey you!" At first, I remained still, assuming that whoever was calling out must be talking to someone else entirely. There was no reason for anyone to be trying to get my attention at this hour. But then the voice followed up with, "Hey you up there!" and my heart skipped a beat as I realized they were definitely addressing me. The question that immediately raced through my mind was why someone would be calling up to me at this time of night. I carefully set my laptop down on the chair and leaned over the railing to look down at the ground below. There was a man standing in front of a car in the parking lot, looking directly up at me, and he confirmed he was talking to me by saying, "Yeah, you." When I asked what he wanted, he told me to come down so he could show me something cool. I took a moment to study this person more carefully, noting his backwards baseball cap and tank top, and initially dismissed him as just some punk kid trying to mess with me. I decided to ignore him and sat back down in my chair, but when I did, I heard him laughing in a way that made my skin crawl. Then he said something that changed everything. "I'm gonna come up there and skin you alive, you prick." I immediately stood up again and looked down at him, and the sight of his face made my blood run cold. He had this deeply unsettling and sinister smile that seemed to promise violence. As I looked at him more carefully, I realized he appeared older than I had initially thought. This wasn't some teenager playing pranks. This was a grown man making serious threats. I opened my mouth to shout something back at him but found myself unable to form words. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and quickly retreated inside, sliding the glass door shut behind me. I expected him to continue yelling threats from below, but surprisingly, I heard nothing more from him. As uncomfortable as the encounter had made me, I felt significantly safer being inside my condo with the door locked. I tried to rationalize what had just happened, telling myself it was probably just some drug-addled Florida lunatic wandering the streets and looking for trouble. However, my sense of security was shattered when the silence in my condo was suddenly broken by violent pounding on my front door, accompanied by a voice screaming obscenities and threats. It was the same man from the parking lot, and the force of his blows against my door was so intense that I genuinely feared he might break it down. All I could do was shout that I was calling the police, but this didn't seem to faze him at all. The pounding transformed into what sounded like carving and stabbing noises, as if he was attacking the door with some kind of weapon. The assault on my door probably lasted only a minute or two, though it felt like an eternity while I stood there in terror. Finally, he gave one last furious bang, screamed one final obscenity at me, and then left. I knew he was gone because I cautiously checked through the peephole to confirm the hallway was empty. After the ordeal was over, I called the police to report the incident and show them the damage. When the officers examined the door, they found several deep stab marks carved into it, confirming that I had indeed heard him attacking it with a knife and that this deranged man had been armed the entire time. I spent the rest of that night praying that nobody else had been harmed by this individual. I doubt he knew me personally. I think he was just a deeply disturbed person, probably high on drugs, who was looking for someone to hurt that night, and I just happened to be the unlucky target he fixated on. The cellmate's revenge. I once had to spend a night in jail, and like everyone says in these situations, I genuinely didn't do anything wrong. The whole mess started when I was attacked by a bouncer at a nightclub in my hometown, all because some girl I had history with decided to lie to him. She had the audacity to tell the bouncer that I was touching her and her friends inappropriately, when in reality I hadn't even spoken a single word to any of them that night. The bouncer immediately got physical with me, putting his hands on me and forcefully pushing me toward the exit of the club. In my intoxicated state, I'll admit that I pushed back against him, which was probably not the smartest decision. Of course, there were police officers stationed right outside the bar, and when it came down to choosing between believing a drunk patron and a club bouncer, you can guess whose side they took. Before I knew it, I was handcuffed in the back of a police car, being driven to the local jail where I would spend the night. The cell they put me in was bare bones, containing nothing more than a single wooden bench for sitting and one other occupant besides myself. This other man immediately asked what I was in for, and I told him it was for absolutely nothing, which was the truth. One look at this guy told me everything I needed to know about how out of place I was in that cell. He had tattoos covering his face, was missing a front tooth, and had the kind of expression that screamed danger. His whole demeanor said, "Don't mess with me or I'll hurt you," and I had no intention of getting on his bad side, so I tried to engage in polite conversation whenever he initiated it. At one point during our confinement, my anger at the injustice of my situation got the better of me, and I felt the need to vent to someone. During this conversation, I made the mistake of sharing some personal information with him, like the fact that I lived in the nicer part of town. I told him about how I had hosted friends at my house earlier that night since my parents were out of town, and how we had all pre-gamed before heading to the club. I basically gave him a complete rundown of my entire evening leading up to my arrest. Since I was still somewhat drunk, I really just wanted to try to sleep off the alcohol and the stress, but my cellmate kept trying to engage me in conversation, which was becoming increasingly annoying. Eventually, I think he picked up on my irritation and finally stopped talking, allowing me some peace. The next morning, we both had to appear in court, and yes, I was sadly charged with assault and trespassing, two completely bogus charges that made my blood boil. My cellmate had to appear before the judge as well, and he was among the other offenders sitting in the back of the courtroom listening to my charges being read. I was released with a future court date set, turning the whole experience into a complete nightmare. That night, when I was finally back in the safety of my own home with all the windows open to let in the cool air, I began hearing footsteps circling around the outside of the house. It wasn't just one set of footsteps either. I could clearly hear multiple people moving around the perimeter of my home. I immediately began shutting all the windows on the first floor, moving from room to room as quickly as possible. When I reached the backyard door, which was a sliding glass door that opened onto our deck, curiosity got the better of me. I flicked on the deck light to illuminate the backyard, and immediately two figures bolted from the light, running off into the darkness beyond. Even in that brief moment, I recognized one of them as my cellmate from the night before. I quickly closed the blind to the door and continued securing the rest of the windows, my mind reeling from the realization that he had actually found me. He was obviously there to rob our house after I had foolishly told him about my parents being away. When I mentioned what part of town I lived in, he must have seen dollar signs, and after hearing my name called in the courtroom, one quick Google search of my simple name would have easily revealed my home address. The two men apparently fled when they realized I was home and awake, because I didn't hear from them for the rest of the night. I never told my parents about getting arrested, and because of that decision, I also never told them about how my cellmate had come to our house with the intention of robbing us blind. The grandmother's warning. This is something that just happened to me recently, and I'm still trying to process how I feel about it beyond being completely freaked out. I've never considered myself a spiritual person, but what occurred has me questioning everything. I had been casually seeing this guy named Spencer on and off for a while, having met him through a coworker one night when we were all out at a bar together, and we seemed to hit it off initially. When I finally felt comfortable enough to introduce him to my family, my parents remained fairly neutral about him, but my grandparents immediately expressed their dislike. My grandmother especially made it clear that she didn't care for Spencer at all. Both of my grandparents said they could see something bad in him, that he didn't seem like a good person, but my grandmother was the most vocal about her concerns. These negative impressions weren't formed after just one meeting either. This was after I had brought Spencer around multiple times, giving everyone plenty of opportunities to get to know him. Honestly, I was beginning to see what they meant because Spencer and I would get into constant arguments, and he had a tendency to lose his temper with me far too easily. This volatile dynamic led to us breaking up and getting back together repeatedly. There was one particularly frightening night when I genuinely felt like he was about to hit me. I could see it in his eyes and his body language, but he managed to hold himself back and eventually calmed down. That was the moment when I decided I was done with him for good and ended the relationship. My grandmother was especially pleased when she heard about the breakup, saying I could do much better and launching into her usual speech about how I should find myself a nice Italian boy from a good family. Tragically, not long after this, my grandmother passed away from a heart attack. During my period of grieving, I decided to hang a framed photograph of her on my bedroom wall as a way to keep her memory close to me. This was only about a month ago, and I had been having an incredibly difficult time dealing with the loss. In a moment of weakness, when Spencer reached out to me 2 weeks ago, I answered his call and agreed to see him. We had been spending time together every night for those 2 weeks, and I genuinely believed he had changed because we hadn't argued once during that time. I felt safe around him again, which I now realize was a terrible mistake. Just a few days ago, Spencer and I agreed to make our relationship official again, becoming boyfriend and girlfriend once more. That very night, I was awakened by a loud crash in my room. I panicked and quickly switched on the lamp, but it took me a moment to notice what had caused the noise. The picture of my grandmother was no longer hanging on the wall where I had placed it. I got out of bed and discovered that the frame had fallen to the floor and cracked upon impact. The timing was impossible to ignore. The picture frame of my grandmother had fallen and broken on the exact night I had agreed to date Spencer again. I held the damaged frame in my trembling hands, my heart caught in my throat, my entire body shaking with the implications of what had just happened. The next day, I called Spencer and told him I thought we should go our separate ways for a while, explaining that my head wasn't in the right place for a relationship. His reaction proved that my grandmother had been right about him all along. He exploded in anger over the phone, yelling and cursing at me for ending things again. That phone call confirmed everything my grandmother had tried to warn me about. But what haunts me most is the picture frame falling and breaking. What could have caused it to fall at that exact moment? There was no draft in the room, no earthquake, no logical explanation for why a securely hung picture would suddenly crash to the floor. Even if I allow myself to imagine that it was somehow a sign from my grandmother, warning me from beyond, that realization is absolutely terrifying in its own way. The voice in the darkness. I decided to take my Jeep on a solo road trip to Colorado, planning to spend my time off-roading through the wilderness trails. I had been exploring various paths around the Red Feather Lakes area, and I was ending my day on the Dead Man's Road Trail, which offered some challenging terrain but rewarded drivers with absolutely breathtaking scenery that made every difficult section worth it. I had packed a sleeping bag with the intention of spending the night in the back of my Jeep after folding down the rear seats to create a makeshift bed. I found a spot to pull off just slightly from the main trail, thinking that on the off chance some other night drivers might pass by, I wouldn't be blocking their path. Though honestly, the likelihood of encountering anyone else out there at night was extremely slim. Some people might think I'm strange for enjoying solo off-roading trips and camping alone in the wilderness, but I've always preferred doing certain things by myself. I call it camping even though I realize it's really more like luxury camping since I'm sleeping in the back of my Jeep instead of a tent on the ground. Still, I'm in the middle of the woods, surrounded by nature, which counts in my book. For dinner, I munched on some protein bars and other snacks I had brought along, then began setting up my sleeping bag in the back of the vehicle. In case you're wondering how I managed all this in the darkness, I had an LED light bar mounted on my Jeep that illuminated the entire surrounding area quite effectively, turning night into day within its range. Finally, I crawled into my sleeping bag, and I'd be lying if I said sleeping in the back of a Jeep is comfortable. The surface is hard and uneven, but for me, it's a small price to pay for the experience of off-roading and waking up to a wilderness sunrise. I had kept all the windows closed to prevent bugs from getting inside, but I could still hear every sound from the forest outside. Then it happened. I heard a voice calling out from somewhere in the woods, followed by a short burst of loud laughter that sent chills down my spine. Given how deep I was on this trail, there was absolutely no way someone would just be walking around out there, not in this complete darkness without any light source. I immediately looked out through the windows, expecting to see the glow of headlights or taillights somewhere in the distance, but there was nothing but blackness. Then I heard the voice again, much clearer this time, though I still couldn't determine if it belonged to a man or woman. What I did know was that I was now shaking with fear. Someone was definitely out there in the darkness, and that realization was terrifying. Although I could hear a voice, I couldn't make out what was being said, just the sound of someone speaking in the void. I lay there in my sleeping bag, paralyzed with fear, waiting for the voice to come again while dreading it at the same time. For a while, all I heard were the normal sounds of crickets and other night insects. Then, much closer than before, I heard a clear voice that belonged to either a woman or a young boy say, "Hello, I see you there." My body wanted to vomit from pure terror. I wanted desperately to climb into the driver's seat and flee, but I was too scared to move a muscle. I felt that if I just stayed lying down, perfectly still, whoever was out there might not actually see me. I know that makes no logical sense since they had already announced they could see me, but hiding and not moving was my instinctive response to cling to the hope that this wasn't really happening. Then came one incredibly loud bang on my rear windshield that made me jump up from my sleeping bag. I practically dove over the two front seats into the driver's position, started the engine, and drove as fast as I safely could manage down the rocky trail. I was terrified that they might be running after me, knowing I could only go so fast on this challenging terrain without risking a rollover. I was afraid to look in the rearview mirror, but when I finally gathered the courage to check, I didn't see anyone in the red glow of my taillights. The entire experience was an absolute nightmare that still haunts me. I was exhausted but forced myself to drive the entire rest of the trail until I reached pavement again, then continued driving for miles until I found a motel where I could safely spend the rest of the night. Some people have asked me whether it might have been someone who was stranded and needed help, but I tell them there's no way. Nobody would be out that deep on a trail in the pitch black darkness that late at night, laughing without any flashlight or source of illumination. And they certainly wouldn't bang on someone's windshield just once like that if they weren't trying to terrify them. People can be truly messed up, and this experience taught me to always watch my back and stay alert to my surroundings, even in places where I think I'm completely alone. The voice from the basement. This remains one of the few completely unexplainable events I've ever experienced in my life, and it still sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. I was home upstairs in my room, focused on writing a paper for my history class, completely absorbed in my work. As far as I knew, I was home alone that afternoon, but apparently I was mistaken about that because I suddenly heard my mother's voice calling out from downstairs, yelling my name. I called back, "What?" and waited for her response, but she didn't answer me. Slightly annoyed at being interrupted when I was in the middle of a good flow with my paper, I reluctantly got up from my desk to go downstairs and see what she needed. When I got to the first floor, I looked around for my mom but couldn't find her anywhere in the usual places. I yelled out, "Mom," and heard her voice call back my name in response. The sound was coming from the basement, so I made my way over to the basement door. Strangely, all the lights were off down there, which immediately struck me as odd. I called down the stairs, "Mom?" again, and once more she responded by calling my name. "What are you doing down there with the lights off?" I yelled down into the darkness, but this time she didn't respond to my question. Growing increasingly uneasy, I flicked on the light switch and began descending the stairs. As I neared the bottom of the steps, I heard my mom call my name yet again, and that's when something clicked in my brain that made my skin crawl. Each time she called my name, it sounded exactly the same, like a recording being played back. There was absolutely zero difference in the inflection, tone, or emotion. Every single time she said my name, it was identical to the last. I called out, "Mom," one more time, and as expected, she responded with my name in that same eerily consistent way. She was nowhere to be seen in the main area of the basement, but then I noticed that the door to our crawl space closet was standing open. It's a strange closet that requires you to duck down and crawl to enter, but it extends into a large portion of the basement. That was the only place left where my mom could possibly be hiding. I said, "Mom," one final time, but this time there was no answer at all. The basement had gone completely silent except for the quiet buzzing sound from the overhead light. I got down on my knees and tried to peer into the crawl space, but it was pitch black inside, and I was starting to feel genuinely frightened by the whole situation. "Mom, are you messing with me?" I asked into the darkness, but there was no response whatsoever, just that oppressive silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. Something deep in my gut told me to get out of there immediately. I stood up and, for reasons I still can't explain, I sprinted back up the stairs as fast as my legs would carry me, slamming the basement door behind me and turning the lock. I had no idea what I had just witnessed or heard down there, but I grabbed the house phone and dialed my mom's cell number with shaking hands. The phone rang several times before my mother finally picked up, and I learned that she was out grocery shopping at the store. When I told her what had just happened, she didn't believe my story at all, thinking I was playing some kind of prank on her. It took half an hour of desperate begging and insisting that I was telling the truth before she finally agreed to take me seriously. When both she and my dad were home later, we all went down to the basement together to investigate. The crawl space door was still open, exactly as I had left it. My dad bravely went inside to check, but there was nobody hiding in there. To this day, this remains the most haunting and completely unexplainable experience of my entire life. I have no rational explanation for what I heard that day, and thinking about it still gives me chills. The stranger's call. I was only about 9 years old when this terrifying incident occurred, but I remember every detail as if it happened yesterday. I was spending the weekend at my grandmother's house, which was something I did frequently when I was little. She always made me feel special and loved during those visits, and I looked forward to them. On this particular day, there was a storm raging outside, and my grandmother had gone to the nearby grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. I was alone in the living room, contentedly watching SpongeBob SquarePants when the phone began to ring. Now, there was absolutely no logical reason for me to answer the phone at my grandmother's house, but you have to remember I was just a little kid with little kid logic. I walked into the kitchen and picked up the phone, and in my small child's voice I said, "Hello," into the receiver. A man's voice on the other end immediately asked, "Can I speak to the adult in the house?" Without thinking about the implications, I innocently replied, "She's not home." The voice responded with a question that immediately made my stomach drop. "So you're all alone right now?" Even at 9 years old, I could sense the danger in that question. I paused for a second before admitting, "Yeah." As soon as the word left my mouth, I knew I had made a terrible mistake in answering the phone. The person on the other end then asked if the current address he had on file was correct, but alarm bells were going off in my head, and I didn't answer that question. Instead, I hung up the phone as quickly as I could. Now I was nervous and worried that I might have gotten my grandmother in some kind of trouble, but I tried to calm myself by returning to the living room in my cartoon. About 20 minutes later, there was frantic, desperate knocking at the front door that made me jump. I muted the television and listened carefully. Along with the violent knocking, someone on the other side was crying out, "Please help," in a man's voice that sounded distressed. I crept over to the edge of the wall where I could peek around the corner at the front door. This turned out to be a mistake because I could see a figure through the glass panel at the top of the door, and worse, they saw me too. The man on the other side immediately changed his approach, saying, "Little boy, please open the door, I'm hurt bad." Pure terror overtook me, and I ran to the far corner of the room by the window, quickly closing the blinds so I could hide behind the couch. I was absolutely terrified, crouched there in my hiding spot. There were no cell phones back then, so I had no way to call my grandmother for help. The man kept pounding on the door with increasing violence, his cries for help beginning to sound more annoyed and aggressive. His knocks grew louder and more frequent, shaking the door in its frame. Then suddenly the pounding on the door stopped, only to be replaced by knocking on the window right next to where I was hiding. The man started saying things like, "I'm not gonna hurt you," and "Please, I'm bleeding bad," but his tone suggested otherwise. Unable to hold back my fear any longer, I started crying in my corner behind the couch, trying to make myself as small as possible. Finally, mercifully, the pounding stopped, and after a minute of silence, I summoned all my courage and ran to my grandmother's bedroom, locking the door behind me. I dove into her bed and hid under the covers with only my head sticking out, listening to the rain hitting the windowsill and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. For a few minutes, the storm sounds were oddly comforting, making me feel like maybe the danger had passed. But then my worst nightmare materialized as the man appeared at one of the bedroom windows and started trying to lift it open. Thank God my grandmother always kept all the windows locked. I immediately hid completely under the covers, pulling them over my head, and I don't think he saw me in the bed. That was the last time I saw or heard from that man. About 20 minutes later, I heard my grandmother come in through the front door, and I ran into her arms, crying and apologizing, pouring out the entire terrifying story. She immediately called the police, and when the officers arrived and needed me to provide whatever details I could remember, my grandmother called me into the room to answer their questions before sending me off to the guest bedroom to watch TV while they continued their investigation. Unfortunately, that man was never caught, at least not for this incident. My grandmother never told my parents about what happened, and she made me promise not to tell them either. I think she didn't want them to worry or to stop letting me stay with her. But she also never left me alone again during any of my subsequent visits, which weren't many after that terrifying experience. The truth is, I was one unlocked door away from being kidnapped that day. If my grandmother hadn't always been so careful about keeping the doors and windows locked, if I had given in to his pleas and opened that door, I would have undoubtedly disappeared forever. The head-banging intruder. I'm a father of 2 boys, ages 15 and 10, and this incident happened during a time when my wife was out of the house running errands. I was in my bedroom taking an afternoon nap, trying to catch up on some much-needed rest. My older son has always been the social type, constantly in and out of the house all day long with his various friends, so when I heard the front door opening and closing repeatedly, it didn't initially concern me. However, after hearing the storm door slam shut for what must have been the 4th time in a short period, I started to get annoyed at the lack of consideration. I whistled loudly from my room, hoping he would get the message to quiet down. Soon after, I began hearing other loud noises coming from across the hallway in the direction of my younger son Keith's room. I figured he must be playing with his wrestling action figures or something similar, creating his own little matches and sound effects. But the noise continued to escalate, becoming too much to ignore even with my bedroom door shut. It was a constant rhythmic thumping sound that made me wonder what on earth Keith could possibly be doing in there. Finally, I'd had enough of trying to sleep through the racket. When I walked across the hall to his room, the noise became much clearer, and I could identify it as a literal thumping against the wall. I entered his room, the door already standing open, ready to scold Keith for making so much noise. But when I said Keith's name angrily, I didn't see my son anywhere. Instead, I saw a grown man facing the wall, repeatedly banging his head against it with disturbing force. There was blood on the wall from where his forehead had been making contact over and over again. The man gave me a side glance without turning his head fully, and in that moment, adrenaline took over. I immediately tackled the man to the floor, using all my strength to pin him down. That's when my son Keith emerged from under his bed sheets where he had been hiding in terror. The man didn't fight back against me at all. Instead, he started yelling incomprehensible nonsense, speaking in what I can only describe as psychotic gibberish that proved his complete lack of sanity. I told Keith to go get the house phone while I held the intruder down, trying to keep my voice calm despite the bizarre and frightening situation. After Keith called the police, I remained in that same position for at least 5 minutes, holding the man down while we waited for the authorities to arrive. During that entire time, the man just kept smiling this disturbing grin and laughing maniacally while spouting things that made absolutely no sense. It was clear that he was either severely mentally ill on some serious drugs or possibly both. The wait for the police felt endless as I held this unstable person on my son's bedroom floor. When the police finally arrived and took him into custody, I chose not to press charges. I'm sure he was taken somewhere to get the help he desperately needed and to get him off the streets where he posed a danger to others. Looking back, I'm just grateful that Keith had the presence of mind to hide under his sheets and that I woke up when I did. The thought of what might have happened if that man had been left alone with my son for much longer is something I try not to dwell on. The family in the bedroom. Throughout my life, I've experienced numerous night terrors and struggled with various sleeping disorders that have made bedtime a challenging experience. I couldn't even begin to count how many times I've experienced sleep paralysis, which is truly one of the most disturbing phenomena a person can go through. I've also woken up countless times seeing spiders and other giant bugs crawling in my bed, only to have them disappear as I slowly return to full consciousness. These hallucinations are always so vivid and realistic that I invariably find myself jumping out of bed screaming, throwing pillows at insects that don't actually exist. And that's not even mentioning the constant nightmares that plague my sleep on a regular basis. It's been an ongoing struggle that has affected my quality of life for years. During one particularly stressful week of school, I was drowning in homework assignments from all my classes, leaving me both mentally and physically exhausted. With half of my assignments due the next day, which was Friday, I was up until extremely late for a school night, probably around 3 in the morning, knowing I would have to wake up in just 3 hours. When I finally finished all my assignments, I literally collapsed into bed, and I was unconscious faster than I could remember ever falling asleep before. That night, I found myself trapped in yet another disturbing dream. In this bizarre nightmare, I was somehow trapped inside a long linear building that I was desperately trying to escape from. As I moved through each room in this strange building, I kept finding pieces of candy scattered about, as if it were some sort of twisted Halloween attraction. But in the dream, I wasn't there for fun. I was running away from something that kept laughing at me. It was a child's laughter that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once, following me through each room. What finally caused me to wake up was reaching what I assumed would be the final door of the building. The laughing had reached its loudest point, and when I grabbed the door handle and pulled it open, I suddenly found myself awake in my bed. But something was wrong. I couldn't move my body at all. Sleep paralysis had taken hold of me once again. Then I heard laughter coming from the middle of my room, not from my dream but from my actual bedroom. I forced my eyes to focus on the center of the room, and what I saw there made my blood turn to ice. There were 4 people standing in the middle of my bedroom, arranged like a family unit. There was a tall male figure and a tall female figure, along with a small boy and a small girl. They were all holding hands in a line, and they were all laughing while staring directly at me with impossibly wide grins on their faces. Their smiles were so exaggerated they seemed to split their faces in half. As I felt the familiar tight pressure in my chest that comes with sleep paralysis, I became aware that these figures were either getting bigger or floating closer to me. It seemed like they were all gliding toward my bed as a unit, their laughter growing louder and their grins growing wider. When my body finally released me from its paralyzed state, I threw the sheets off myself and hurled my pillows toward the middle of the room while screaming at the top of my lungs. But the pillows hit nothing but air, as the four figures had vanished completely, and the horrible laughter had stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I had experienced sleep paralysis many times before, but I had never encountered a hallucination of this magnitude or this level of terror. The next day, I made an emergency appointment with my doctor, who prescribed me new medication to help with my sleep disorders. Since then, I've continued to have my share of night terrors, but nothing has ever come close to matching the horror of that night with the laughing family. The Jersey Shore blackout. This terrifying incident happened just last year, and it still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. My buddy Jimmy has become pretty well connected within the music community over the past few years, specifically in the dance and electronic music scene that stretches all along the East Coast, with a particular focus on New Jersey and New York. What he and his team have managed to accomplish in just 2 years is genuinely impressive, hosting what they call events at some of the most high-profile venues in whatever city they happen to be performing in. They typically book the most well-known clubs or party spaces in each location, then bring in incredibly talented DJs, many of whom are borderline famous in the electronic music world. While I'm not deeply invested in that particular scene myself, I've heard that they've managed to book some huge names that would make any electronic music fan's jaw drop. Jimmy and I go way back, and I'm talking about over 20 years of friendship that started when we were just kids. He's been my best friend for most of my life, and because of our deep connection, he always lets me and our other hometown friends attend his shows for free, even giving us access to the VIP sections where we can hang out with the talent. It's an incredible privilege that I probably don't express enough gratitude for, but Jimmy knows how much it means to all of us. Jimmy was scheduled to host a massive event during the July 4th weekend on the Jersey Shore, which was set to be their biggest production yet. All our mutual friends were planning to attend, and Jimmy invited me to come down early with him to help with the setup. I obviously jumped at the chance, and the two of us made the hour-and-a-half drive down with our other friend Ryan, arriving at the venue a good 4 hours before the doors were scheduled to open. While Jimmy and his team busied themselves with setting up the equipment and preparing for the night, Ryan and I found ourselves with nothing much to do. We decided to get a head start on the evening's festivities by taking advantage of the complimentary alcohol that the venue provided to Jimmy and his team. By the time the first DJ started their set, Ryan and I were more than a little buzzed, which felt justified given that it was 4th of July weekend. Fast forward a couple of hours, and Ryan and I were completely wasted, more drunk than I can remember being at any point since that night. Don't get me wrong, we're both grown men who can typically handle our alcohol without making fools of ourselves or getting sick, but the real issue was the lowered impulse control and impaired decision-making that comes with that level of intoxication. As the event was winding down and people were starting to figure out their plans for getting home or deciding who they were going home with, Ryan and I found ourselves at the bar talking to some attractive girls. Jimmy had already secured us beds at a nearby Airbnb, so we didn't have to worry about where we were sleeping, which left us free to focus on more social pursuits. Neither Ryan nor I are male models by any stretch, but we're both over 6 feet tall, which seems to be a major advantage at the Jersey Shore where most guys tend to be shorter than average. For whatever reason, height seems to be the primary attribute that girls in that area look for, not looks or intelligence or personality, just height. The two girls introduced themselves as Gianna and Marcella, though I might be getting their names wrong since my memory gets increasingly hazy from this point forward. It was actually Marcella who suggested we all leave together to continue partying elsewhere, and neither Ryan nor I were going to argue with that proposition. Gianna handed us each a drink, insisting we needed to get on their level before heading out, despite the fact that we had probably already consumed an entire person's worth of alcohol between us. After downing the drinks, we headed toward the exit, and once outside, Marcella suggested we go back to her beach house, which she claimed was nearby and right on the water. This actually surprised me since I expected we'd be going back to our Airbnb, but both girls insisted that Marcella's place would be much nicer than whatever inland rental we had secured. We walked along the beach, engaged in surprisingly intelligent conversation that made me feel refreshed to be talking about something other than nightlife for once. I actually started feeling embarrassed about being so drunk because I felt like I couldn't articulate myself properly and probably looked like an idiot. That's when I realized I was actually feeling drunker than I had been just 15 minutes earlier, but it wasn't a normal kind of drunk. My body felt like it was melting under its own weight, as if I might collapse at any moment, and my legs felt as flimsy as cardboard. Moving my limbs, mouth, and even my eyes became increasingly difficult, and my extremities started going numb. Then, just as quickly as these sensations arose, they passed, returning me to a more normal state of intoxication. We arrived at the beach house, which looked like something a professional athlete would own, with a level of opulence that was completely foreign to anything I was used to. The living room was somehow both decorative and minimalistic, with actual sculptures on pedestals that somehow didn't make the space feel cluttered. Within 15 minutes of entering the house, Ryan and Marcella had disappeared somewhere into that maze of rooms, leaving me alone with Gianna. She leaned in to kiss me, and that's the last thing I remember before everything goes completely black. Not the kiss itself, but her leaning in toward me is where my memory cuts off entirely. There's a massive gap spanning several hours that won't come back no matter how hard I try to remember, and I know I didn't simply pass out because there are text messages sent from my phone proving I was still conscious and moving around. The next thing I remember is waking up with the sun directly overhead, lying in a random set of bushes over an hour away from where the event had been held. My phone wasn't in my pocket, and neither was my wallet or keys, but worse than that, I wasn't even wearing my own clothes. I was dressed in a complete stranger's outfit, and the only personal belongings I still had were my shoes, which had their laces removed and were soaking wet. My head was pounding and everything felt disoriented, like I was emerging from anesthesia, and I just lay there staring at the sky trying to make sense of my situation. The panic started creeping in as I realized I had no memory of the past 10 hours and no idea how I'd gotten to this location. I stood up and saw a 7-Eleven across the street, the only landmark in sight, so I headed straight for it. I asked the clerk if I could use his phone, explaining that mine had been stolen, and after some hesitation he slid it across the counter. I called my sister, whose number was one of the few I still had memorized, and she gave me Ryan's number, which I tried calling several times with no answer. Just as I was about to call the police, Ryan walked into the same 7-Eleven, and we stared at each other in disbelief before he told me his story, which was virtually identical to mine. We called the police and recounted our experience, but as we told them more details, their questions became increasingly skeptical. They suggested we had simply drunk too much and wandered off, which frustrated me since I pointed out it was unlikely we would have drunkenly walked to a town an hour away. My sister had been tracking my phone, and surprisingly, it showed up in a parking lot nearby where we found both our phones sitting on the pavement next to each other. This discovery only reinforced the police's theory that we had just been drunk, and they refused to investigate the beach house despite our insistence. They gave us their cards and told us to find a ride home, leaving us standing there in confusion. When I checked my phone, I found texts I had apparently sent to various people throughout the night, all sounding coherent but making no sense when considered together. Ryan and I eventually made our way back to the shore to search for the beach house, and we actually found it. When we rang the doorbell, an older man answered and denied knowing any Marcella or having any young female relatives. I made up a story about someone lying about owning the house, which he found amusing, but I walked away with a sick feeling in my stomach. To this day, I'm convinced those girls were involved in something much bigger than we could comprehend, possibly planning to kidnap or kill us before changing their minds at the last moment. I'll never have answers, but if anything else happens, I'll definitely share an update. The Alabama Stalker. My name is Ariel, and I live in Georgia, not too far from the Alabama border, in one of those areas where the state lines blur together. Several summers ago, I made the drive out to a small town in Alabama for a 4th of July cookout that my college friend Isabel was hosting at her place. It was one of those perfect backyard gatherings with paper plates scattered on picnic tables, bootleg fireworks crackling in the distance, and way too much food for anyone to possibly finish. The night turned out to be one of the better evenings I'd had in quite a while, filled with good people, positive energy, and kids running around with sparklers painting light trails in the darkness. I didn't end up leaving until a little after 10 o'clock, which looking back now, was probably my first mistake of the night. That particular part of the state transforms into something entirely different once the sun goes down, becoming eerily quiet and isolated. The drive home was going to take me a little over 2 hours, and most of the route consisted of back roads and long empty stretches of dark two-lane highways with nothing but thick tree lines pressing in on either side. Every now and then, I'd pass an old farmhouse with a single porch light burning or a tiny church with a gravel parking lot, but for the most part, it was just endless darkness stretching out before my headlights. I had music playing softly in the background, and I was still riding the good mood from the party, but I won't lie about the unease that crept in. There's something about driving through places like that at night that gets under my skin, even when there's no real reason to be afraid. I've always been somewhat scared of the dark since childhood, so I'm sure that childhood fear plays into my discomfort on those lonely roads. About 30 minutes into my journey home, I noticed a pair of headlights appear in my rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming someone else had just turned onto the same back road, probably heading home from their own 4th of July celebration. But the longer those lights stayed there, maintaining the exact same distance, the more I started to pay attention to them. It was a gray Nissan Altima, nothing particularly unusual about the make or model, except I noticed the bottom half of the car looked like it had been driving through mud. I could see this clearly whenever we passed under one of those occasional overhead lights at small crossings, the dried mud caking the lower panels of the vehicle. Even that detail wasn't necessarily weird on its own, given the rural roads we were traveling. But after a while, I realized that no matter how much I varied my speed, that car matched me exactly, like we were connected by an invisible rope. When I sped up by 5 or 10 miles per hour over what I had been doing, the Altima did the same, maintaining that precise distance. When I tapped my brakes and let myself drift well below the speed limit, again the same results occurred. Now, on roads like that, people pass each other all the time without a second thought, and it's not even illegal in most spots. I moved slightly to the right a couple of times, making it obvious that I was giving them all the space they needed if they wanted to go around me, but they didn't take the opportunity. They just stayed exactly where they were, about 6 or 7 car lengths back, matching my every move. That's when I decided to test them with something more definitive. There was a random left turn coming up that led to what looked like a small residential road with maybe 4 houses scattered on either side. Without using my turn signal, I took the turn suddenly, hoping to lose them or at least confirm my suspicions. About 10 seconds later, my heart sank as I watched the Altima make the same left turn behind me. In the middle of nowhere, on a road where they had absolutely no reason to be, they were still following me. At that point, I knew for certain that this wasn't a coincidence, and a sick feeling settled into my gut like I was in genuine danger. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, the same way it would if someone had a gun pointed at my head. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard that awful chime that indicates a nearly empty gas tank, and I swear I've never felt so powerless in my entire life. My car is old, a 2012 Corolla that's been through more than its fair share of problems, and sometimes the gas light gives me 20 miles, while other times I'm lucky to get 10. Out there in that part of the state, gas stations are few and far between. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and searched for the nearest 24-hour gas station, which showed up as being over 8 miles away. I didn't know if I'd make it, but I didn't have any other choice because I certainly wasn't about to pull over with that car still tailing me. I thought about calling the police, but I felt like it would be a waste of time so far out in the middle of nowhere where response times are measured in hours, not minutes. The gas needle dropped to completely empty a couple minutes later, not just low but sitting firmly on E, and I tried to stay calm even as I could feel myself starting to spiral into panic. Every little sound the car made seemed amplified, every mile stretched out endlessly, and I felt stupid for being so powerless in this situation. Scenarios started flashing through my head about what would happen once my car inevitably ran out of gas on this dark, empty road. But by some miracle, I finally spotted the glow of a gas station sign up ahead, that beautiful fluorescent beacon cutting through the darkness. I almost cried with relief, taking the turn hard and pulling into the lot in one quick motion to give myself time to get out of the car and run inside. I jumped out and ran for the door, barely remembering to shut my car door behind me in my haste. From inside the brightly lit store, I could see the Altima through the window as it slowed to a stop at the edge of the parking lot. It sat there for maybe 10 seconds with the engine still running and no one got out. It was almost like whoever was inside was debating whether to continue pursuing me or abandon whatever plan they had. Then, out of nowhere, the car peeled off fast and disappeared back down the road we had come from. I told the gas station attendant what had happened, my voice shaking as I recounted the past hour, and he immediately offered to call the police for me. Even after talking to the officers who eventually arrived, I still felt deeply unsettled by the whole experience. I made it home that night and promised myself I would never drive along rural back roads in the middle of the night ever again. The story doesn't end there though, and what happened next made my stomach drop all over again. A few weeks later, I was sitting at home with the news playing in the background when a segment came on about two men suspected of armed robbery, attempted murder, and a string of other violent crimes in rural Alabama. They showed a blurry image from a security camera and mentioned that authorities believed the suspects had fled in a stolen gray Nissan Altima, last seen heading east. When I heard those details, I just froze completely, every muscle in my body tensing up. That's who had been following me that night. I knew it in my gut with absolute certainty. The timing lined up perfectly, the location matched, and the description of the car was identical to what had stalked me through those dark roads. I immediately called the police to report my story again, and that's when the full weight of everything really hit me. My own fear and hesitation to call the police sooner could have prevented two extremely dangerous men from being caught, and I will never forgive myself for that. It's something I actually think about pretty often, wondering if my information could have helped catch them sooner, potentially preventing other victims. I never got an update from the police about whether my report helped, and I never heard anything more about the case on the news, but if anything ever changes, I'll definitely send an update. The Wedding Photographer's Nightmare. My name is Marcus, and I've been a wedding photographer for about 8 years now, capturing what should be the happiest moments of people's lives. I've shot hundreds of weddings across the southeastern United States, from lavish country club affairs to intimate backyard ceremonies, and I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened at a wedding in rural Tennessee last fall, an experience that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The booking came through my website in early September, which was pretty standard for an October wedding. The bride, Sarah, seemed lovely during our initial phone consultation, bubbling with excitement about her upcoming big day. She and her fiancé, Derek, were planning a rustic barn wedding on his family's property, about 2 hours outside of Nashville. The venue sounded picturesque, and the deposit cleared without any issues, so I marked October 15th on my calendar and didn't think much more about it beyond the usual pre-wedding preparations. As the date approached, I exchanged several emails with Sarah about the shot list, the timeline, and all the usual details that go into planning wedding photography. Everything seemed perfectly normal, though I did notice she was very insistent about capturing certain specific moments and locations on the property. She mentioned multiple times that there was an old oak tree near the barn that held special significance for Derek's family, and she wanted to make sure we got plenty of shots there. I assured her that wouldn't be a problem and made a note to scout the location when I arrived. The drive out to the venue on the morning of the wedding was beautiful, with fall colors painting the rolling hills in shades of gold and crimson. I always arrive at least 2 hours early to scope out the location, test the lighting, and capture some detail shots before the chaos begins. My GPS led me down increasingly narrow roads until I finally turned onto a long gravel driveway marked with white balloons and a hand-painted sign reading Sarah and Derek's Big Day. The property was exactly what you'd expect from a rustic Tennessee wedding venue. There was a massive red barn that had been converted for events, string lights crisscrossing overhead, and mason jars filled with wildflowers lining the driveway. But something felt off from the moment I parked my car. Maybe it was the unusual silence, or the way the morning fog seemed to cling to the ground despite the sun being well up in the sky, but I had an immediate sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I grabbed my gear and headed toward the barn, expecting to find the usual pre-wedding bustle of vendors setting up, bridesmaids giggling over mimosas, and stressed-out family members double-checking arrangements. Instead, I found the barn almost empty except for a few workers quietly arranging chairs in perfectly straight rows. When I asked one of them where I could find Sarah or the wedding coordinator, he just pointed toward the main house without saying a word. The house was a sprawling Victorian that had clearly seen better days, with peeling paint and a wraparound porch that sagged in places. I knocked on the front door and was greeted by an older woman who introduced herself as Derek's mother, though she seemed surprised to see me there so early. She directed me to an upstairs room where Sarah was getting ready with her bridesmaids, but as I climbed the creaking stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The bridal suite was dim despite the morning light streaming through the windows, and the energy in the room was nothing like what I typically experienced at weddings. Sarah sat at an antique vanity while a woman I assumed was her mother fixed her hair, but there was no excited chatter, no pop music playing, no champagne toasts. The bridesmaids stood around in their matching burgundy dresses, barely speaking above whispers. When Sarah saw me in the mirror, she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I started taking the usual getting ready shots, trying to inject some energy into the room with my typical photographer banter, but every attempt at conversation fell flat. The bridesmaids would barely look at me, and Sarah's responses were monosyllabic at best. Even more unsettling was the way they all kept glancing at the clock on the wall, as if they were dreading something rather than anticipating it. When it came time to photograph Sarah putting on her dress, her mother and the bridesmaids helped her into an elaborate vintage gown that looked like it had been in the family for generations. The dress was beautiful but seemed almost too heavy for Sarah's slight frame, and I noticed her hands were trembling as they fastened the long row of buttons up the back. I tried to capture some joyful moments, suggesting poses that usually brought out genuine smiles, but the atmosphere remained oppressively somber. Derek and his groomsmen were getting ready in a guest house on the other side of the property, and the contrast when I arrived there was stark. Where the bridal suite had been quiet and tense, the groom's quarters were completely silent. Derek sat alone in a leather armchair, already fully dressed in his tuxedo, staring out the window at the fog-shrouded fields. His groomsmen stood around the edges of the room like statues, not talking, not moving, just waiting. When I introduced myself and started setting up for some shots, Derek turned to look at me with the strangest expression I'd ever seen on a groom's face. It wasn't nervousness or excitement or even fear. It was resignation, like a man walking to his execution. I tried to lighten the mood with some jokes about wedding day jitters, but he just shook his head slowly and said, "You don't understand. This has to happen." Before I could ask what he meant, one of the groomsmen placed a hand on Derek's shoulder and suggested we head outside for some portraits. The way they all moved in unison, surrounding Derek as we walked to the photo locations, made me feel like I was documenting something other than a wedding. They seemed less like groomsmen and more like guards, keeping Derek moving forward when he occasionally faltered. The fog was even thicker near the old oak tree Sarah had mentioned so many times in our correspondence. It was a massive, gnarled thing that looked like it had been there for centuries, with branches that twisted in unnatural directions. The ground around it was bare of grass in a perfect circle, and I noticed strange symbols carved into the bark that looked fresher than they should have. When I raised my camera to capture some shots of Derek and his groomsmen beneath the tree, they all stood in very specific positions, as if they'd rehearsed this exact arrangement many times before. As I worked, I noticed other odd details that made my skin crawl. All the groomsmen wore matching pins on their lapels that looked like some kind of ancient symbol I didn't recognize. Derek kept touching a chain around his neck, pulling out what looked like a small vial filled with dark liquid before quickly tucking it back under his shirt. And despite the October chill, I was sweating profusely, the air around the tree feeling thick and oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with humidity. We returned to the barn for the ceremony setup, and I busied myself with detailed shots of the decorations, trying to ignore the growing sense of wrongness permeating everything. The flower arrangements were beautiful but strange, featuring plants I didn't recognize mixed with more traditional roses and baby's breath. The programs had the usual order of service printed on them, but the back was covered in text written in what looked like Latin or some other ancient language. As guests began arriving, I positioned myself to capture candid shots of people finding their seats and greeting each other. But these weren't the joyful reunions I was used to photographing. People embraced with what looked like grief rather than celebration, and more than one person was openly crying as they took their seats. Everyone was dressed in dark colors despite this being an afternoon wedding, and many of them wore jewelry featuring that same strange symbol I'd seen on the groomsmen's pins. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at exactly 3:33 p.m., and as that time approached, the atmosphere in the barn became almost unbearably tense. Sarah's processional music began, played on instruments I couldn't identify, creating a haunting melody that made the hair on my arms stand up. As she appeared in the doorway, flanked by her father and another older man I hadn't been introduced to, every guest rose to their feet in perfect synchronization. Sarah's walk down the aisle was nothing like the joyful moments I'd captured at hundreds of other weddings. She moved slowly, mechanically, her eyes fixed on something beyond Derek at the altar. Her father and the other man seemed to be supporting most of her weight, practically carrying her forward. The train of her vintage dress dragged behind her, and I swear I saw it catch on something that wasn't there, pulling back as if invisible hands were trying to stop her progress. When they reached the altar, the officiant began speaking in a language I didn't understand, though occasional English phrases broke through. I heard mentions of binding, ancient promises, and blood debts that made my stomach turn. This was clearly not a standard wedding ceremony, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave. But I was a professional and I'd been paid to do a job, so I kept shooting, my finger mechanically pressing the shutter button as my mind tried to process what I was witnessing. The exchange of rings was particularly disturbing. Instead of the traditional wedding bands I'd seen in the detail shots earlier, Derek and Sarah each produced ornate rings that looked far older than anything else in the ceremony. When Derek slipped the ring onto Sarah's finger, she let out a small cry of pain, and I saw a drop of blood well up where the metal touched her skin. Through my zoom lens, I could see that the inside of the ring had tiny spikes that pressed into her flesh. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and passionless, more like a business transaction than a romantic moment. But what happened next made me lower my camera in shock. The moment their lips parted, every candle in the barn flared simultaneously, the flames shooting up several feet before settling back to normal height. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath, and several guests began chanting in that unknown language, their voices creating a discordant harmony that made my chest tight with panic. Sarah collapsed immediately after the kiss, her body going limp in Derek's arms. The wedding party surrounded them, blocking my view, but I could hear Sarah crying and Derek repeatedly apologizing, saying, "I'm sorry," over and over again. When the crowd finally parted, Sarah was on her feet again, but something had changed. Her posture was different, straighter and more confident, and when she turned to face the guests, her eyes were completely black. The recessional that followed was more like a funeral march than a celebration. As the couple walked back down the aisle, guests reached out to touch Sarah's dress, many of them weeping openly. She moved with an unnatural grace now, seeming to glide rather than walk, and the train of her dress no longer caught on invisible obstacles. Derek followed behind her like a man in a trance, his face pale and his movements robotic. I should have left then. Every rational part of my brain was telling me to pack up my gear and get out of there as fast as possible. But I was in too deep, and morbid curiosity kept me rooted in place as the guests filed out of the barn toward the reception area. The sun was setting now, and long shadows stretched across the property, making everything look distorted and wrong. The reception was set up in a clearing near the oak tree, with long tables arranged in a pattern that looked almost ritualistic from above. I climbed onto a small hill to get some elevated shots and immediately wished I hadn't. From that vantage point, I could see that the table arrangement formed a symbol, the same one I'd been seeing all day on jewelry and decorations. Torches had been lit around the perimeter, their flames dancing in a wind I couldn't feel. As the guests took their seats, servers emerged from the shadows carrying covered dishes. The smell that wafted from these plates was wrong somehow, metallic and sweet in a way that made my stomach churn. I watched through my lens as guests uncovered their meals and began eating with mechanical precision. No one speaking, no clinking of glasses, no laughter or conversation. It was the most unsettling dinner service I'd ever witnessed. Sarah and Derek sat at a raised table overlooking the scene, but Sarah didn't eat. She sat perfectly still, those black eyes surveying the gathering like a predator watching prey. Derek beside her looked increasingly ill, pushing food around his plate without taking a bite. At one point, he tried to take Sarah's hand, but she pulled away with a movement so fast it was almost inhuman. The speeches began as full darkness fell, and they were nothing like the heartfelt toasts I was used to capturing. Speaker after speaker stood and recited what sounded like incantations, their words rhythmic and hypnotic. Some spoke of debts being paid, others of cycles completing, and several mentioned that this had been ordained long before Sarah and Derek were even born. One elderly woman spoke of Sarah's grandmother and a promise made in desperate times, her voice breaking as she looked at what Sarah had become. As the formal events wound down, the guests began moving toward the oak tree in a procession. Without being directed, they formed a circle around its massive trunk, holding hands and beginning to chant. Sarah rose from her seat and moved to the center of the circle with that same unnatural grace, her dress seeming to glow in the torchlight. Derek tried to follow, but two groomsmen held him back, forcing him to watch from outside the circle. What happened next defied explanation. The symbols carved into the tree began to emit a faint light, pulsing in rhythm with the chanting. The ground within the circle started to crack and shift, as if something massive was moving beneath it. Sarah raised her arms and her voice joined the chant, but it was layered somehow, as if multiple voices were speaking through her. The fog that had clung to the ground all day began to swirl upward, forming shapes that hurt to look at directly. I kept shooting, my professional instincts overriding my terror, but many of the photos I took during this part of the evening came out corrupted, showing impossible things that my eyes hadn't seen. In some frames, Sarah appeared to have multiple arms or shadows that moved independently. In others, figures that hadn't been visible to the naked eye stood among the guests, tall and twisted and definitely not human. The ritual, for that's clearly what this was, reached a crescendo when Sarah pulled out a knife I hadn't seen before and made a cut on her palm. But instead of blood, something black and viscous dripped from the wound onto the ground. Where it touched, the earth split open wider, and a sound emerged that I can only describe as hungry. The guests' chanting grew louder, more frantic, and several people collapsed, overwhelmed by whatever forces they'd invoked. That's when I finally broke. I shoved my camera into my bag and ran, not caring about professionalism or the rest of my payment or anything except getting away from that cursed place. Behind me, I could hear the chanting reaching impossible volumes, and underneath it, something that sounded like laughter but couldn't have been. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. As I sped down the gravel driveway, I made the mistake of looking in my rearview mirror. The entire property was bathed in an unnatural light, and rising above the tree line was something that my mind simply refused to process. It was massive and dark and moved in ways that violated everything I understood about physics. I pressed harder on the accelerator, taking the curves of the country roads at dangerous speeds, not slowing down until I was back on the highway with other cars around me. I drove straight home, a 3-hour journey that felt like minutes and years simultaneously. When I finally made it to my apartment, I locked every door, closed every blind, and sat in my bathtub fully clothed, trying to process what I'd witnessed. I stayed there until sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me home, that by documenting whatever ritual I'd witnessed, I'd become part of it somehow. The next day, I tried to edit the photos, telling myself I had a professional obligation to deliver what I'd been paid for. But as I went through them on my computer, I found that many were corrupted beyond recognition. The ones that were intact showed things that made me delete them immediately. In some, the guests' faces were wrong, features shifted into configurations that weren't quite human. In others, shadows moved independently of their sources, reaching toward the camera with grasping tendrils. I found one photo that made me slam my laptop shut and not open it for days. It was a shot of Sarah and Derek during the ceremony, but in the background, standing just behind the officiant, was a figure that hadn't been there. It was tall and thin and wore clothing that seemed to be made of shadows. Its face was turned toward my camera, and where eyes should have been, there were only deep, dark holes that seemed to pull at something inside me. I tried to contact Sarah to tell her the photos were corrupted and offer a refund, but the email bounced back. The phone number she'd given me was disconnected. When I searched for the venue online, I found nothing. It was as if the entire wedding had been erased from existence. The only proof I had that it happened at all were the corrupted files on my memory cards and the payment that had cleared in my bank account. For weeks afterward, I had nightmares about that oak tree and the circle of chanting guests. I would wake up in a cold sweat, certain I could hear that multi-layered voice calling my name. Objects in my apartment would move when I wasn't looking, and more than once I found my camera had taken photos on its own while I slept. They all showed the same thing: darkness with hints of movement, suggestions of forms that shouldn't exist. I've mostly recovered now, though I no longer shoot weddings. I've transitioned to commercial photography, nice safe product shots in well-lit studios where nothing unexpected ever happens. But sometimes when I'm editing late at night and the shadows grow long, I'll see something move in my peripheral vision. And occasionally, very occasionally, I'll find a photo on my memory card that I didn't take, showing a familiar oak tree and a woman in a vintage dress whose eyes are black as midnight. I've never spoken about this publicly before, but I needed to share it somewhere. If you're a wedding photographer and you get a booking for a rural venue in Tennessee, especially one involving an old oak tree, please think twice. Some moments aren't meant to be captured, and some promises made in desperation echo through generations in ways we can't imagine. Sarah's grandmother made a deal and Sarah paid the price. I just happened to be there to document the transaction, and I'll carry those images with me forever, whether I want to or not. The substitute teacher's secret. My name is Jennifer, and I've been teaching 5th grade for 12 years at Riverside Elementary, a small school in suburban Michigan. It's the kind of place where you know every family, where former students come back to visit years later, and where the biggest drama usually involves playground disputes or forgotten homework. That's why what happened last spring was so profoundly disturbing, shattering the sense of safety and normalcy we'd all taken for granted. It started in March when our usual substitute teacher, Mrs. Patterson, retired to Florida. The district scrambled to find reliable subs, which is always a challenge, especially for long-term positions. When Mrs. Chin in 3rd grade had to take extended medical leave, the principal was thrilled to find Ms. Vega, a substitute with glowing references and 15 years of experience. She seemed perfect on paper, multilingual, tech-savvy, and enthusiastic about innovative teaching methods. I first met Ms. Vega during a staff meeting 3 days after she started. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with jet black hair pulled into a severe bun and clothes that seemed too formal for elementary school. While the rest of us wore comfortable, kid-friendly attire, she dressed like she was heading to a corporate boardroom. But what struck me most were her eyes. They were dark brown, almost black, and when she looked at you, it felt like she was cataloging information, filing away every detail for later use. During introductions, she gave a brief background about teaching internationally, mentioning schools in Romania, Chile, and South Korea. Her accent was hard to place, shifting subtly as she spoke, and when someone asked where she was originally from, she simply smiled and said, "I'm a citizen of the world." It was the kind of non-answer that should have raised red flags, but we were all too polite to push further. The first few weeks seemed to go smoothly. Ms. Vega's class was unusually quiet, which we initially attributed to her strict discipline style. Through the thin walls, I could hear her speaking in a low, measured tone, never raising her voice even when dealing with typically rowdy students. During recess duty, I noticed her 3rd graders stayed close to her rather than running off to play, clustered around her like baby ducks following their mother. It was Tommy Burke who first made me really pay attention. Tommy was in my class, a bright kid with an active imagination and a tendency to embellish stories. One afternoon, he stayed after school to help me clean the whiteboard, and out of nowhere he asked, "Mrs. J, do you think Ms. Vega is a real person?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean, Tommy?" "Of course she's real." He scrunched up his face, thinking hard. "My sister Emma is in her class and she says Ms. Vega knows things. Like private things. Emma never told her about our dog dying last year, but Ms. Vega brought it up during share time. And she knew our grandma's name and that she lives in Arizona, even though Emma never mentioned her." I tried to rationalize it. "Maybe she read Emma's file? Or your parents might have mentioned it?" Tommy shook his head vigorously. "No, Emma asked Mom. They never talked to her. And it's not just Emma. Jackson says she knew about his dad's new job before his dad even told him. And Lucy says Ms. Vega described her bedroom perfectly, even though she's never been to their house." Kids exaggerate, I told myself. They misremember conversations. But Tommy's words stuck with me, and I found myself paying closer attention to Ms. Vega over the following days. During lunch duty, I watched her with her students. She would lean in close when they spoke, her hand resting on their shoulders, and their expressions would go blank for a moment before returning to normal. It was subtle, but once I started looking for it, I saw it happen repeatedly. The real turning point came during the spring parent-teacher conferences. I was staying late to finish up my meetings when I heard voices from Ms. Vega's classroom. The walls in our old building were thin and sound carried easily. At first, it sounded like a normal parent conference, but then I heard something that made me freeze. "I don't understand how you know about that," a woman's voice said, shaky with emotion. "We've never told anyone about the miscarriage. Not even family." Ms. Vega's response was calm, almost hypnotic. "Your daughter is very perceptive. Children often know more than we think. She's been worried about you, wondering if she did something to make the baby go away." The mother started crying and I heard chairs scraping. The conversation continued, but I couldn't make out the words anymore. What disturbed me wasn't just that Ms. Vega somehow knew about this private family matter, but the way she used it, wielding intimate knowledge like a tool. Over the next few weeks, I started documenting strange occurrences. Parents began requesting meetings with the principal, looking confused and unsettled after conferences with Ms. Vega. Several mentioned that she knew things about their families that they'd never shared, personal details that even close friends didn't know. One father, a usually composed lawyer, left her classroom visibly shaken, muttering about privacy violations and background checks. The children in her class were changing too. Previously outgoing kids became withdrawn, speaking in hushed tones and jumping at sudden noises. They stopped playing with students from other classes, preferring to huddle together at recess, whispering and glancing around nervously. When I tried to engage them, they would give me hollow smiles and polite responses before quickly excusing themselves. Emma Burke, Tommy's sister, was the most dramatic transformation. She'd always been a chatterbox, full of stories and questions. But by early April, she barely spoke above a whisper. During a school assembly, I sat near her class and noticed her hands trembling as she held her music sheet. When I asked if she was okay, she looked at me with wide, frightened eyes and whispered, "She's always watching even when she's not there." I decided to do some investigating. During my prep period, I walked past Ms. Vega's classroom and peered through the door window. The students sat in perfect rows, hands folded on their desks, eyes forward. But Ms. Vega wasn't teaching. She was sitting at her desk, eyes closed, lips moving slightly as if in prayer. The children remained motionless, not even fidgeting for the entire 10 minutes I watched. It was unnatural, the kind of stillness you don't see in 8-year-olds. That afternoon, I approached my principal, Dr. Martinez, with my concerns. She listened patiently but seemed skeptical. "Jennifer, I understand you're worried, but Ms. Vega's class has the highest test scores we've seen in years. No parent has filed a formal complaint. And frankly, we're lucky to have a long-term sub of her caliber." I pushed harder. "Have you observed her teaching? Spent time in her classroom?" Dr. Martinez admitted she hadn't, promising to schedule an observation soon. But I could tell she thought I was overreacting, maybe even jealous of the new teacher's success. I left her office frustrated and increasingly worried about what was happening in that third-grade classroom. The breaking point came the following Monday. I arrived early to prepare for the week and found Emma Burke sitting alone in the hallway outside Ms. Vega's locked classroom. She was rocking slightly, clutching her backpack, tears streaming down her face. "Emma, sweetheart, what's wrong?" I knelt beside her, alarmed by her distress. "I don't want to know anymore," she whispered. "I don't want to see the bad things before they happen." "What bad things? What are you talking about?" She looked at me with eyes that seemed far too old for her age. "Ms. Vega taught us to see. But I saw Grandma in the hospital and Mom crying and Dad packing boxes. I don't want to know these things. I want to be normal again." Before I could respond, the classroom door opened, and Ms. Vega stood there, smiling that unsettling smile. "Good morning, Emma. Come inside. We have work to do." Emma stood robotically and walked into the classroom without another word. Ms. Vega turned to me, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. Her eyes were depthless, ancient, filled with a knowledge that made my skin crawl. "Children are so much more capable than we give them credit for, don't you think, Jennifer?" The way she said my name made it sound like a threat. That day, I couldn't concentrate on teaching. During my lunch break, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I looked up Ms. Vega online. Her employment history was sparse, with gaps that didn't make sense. The schools she'd mentioned during her introduction either didn't exist or had no record of her employment. Her teaching certification was from a state she'd never mentioned working in, and the photo on her LinkedIn profile was blurry, possibly artificially aged. I dug deeper, finding a news article from 5 years ago about a school in Oregon where several children had suffered what doctors called collective psychological episodes after exposure to a substitute teacher. The teacher's name was different, but the description matched Ms. Vega. The article mentioned children claiming to have visions, and parents reporting that their kids knew things they couldn't possibly know. The substitute had disappeared before authorities could question her. There was another incident in New Mexico 3 years ago, another in Maine last year. Always the same pattern. A substitute teacher with stellar credentials, children exhibiting strange behaviors and knowledge, then the teacher vanishing when questions arose. The photos were always blurry, but the eyes, those dark, knowing eyes, were the same. I printed everything and took it to Dr. Martinez the next morning. This time, she listened with growing concern. By lunch, she'd contacted the district office and discovered that several of Ms. Vega's references were unreachable, their phone numbers disconnected. An emergency meeting was called for after school. But Ms. Vega didn't show up for the meeting. Her classroom was empty, cleaned out as if she'd never been there. No resignation letter, no forwarding address, nothing. Even stranger, when we tried to access her personnel file, the digital records were corrupted, showing only gibberish. The paper copies were blank, as if the ink had faded overnight. The aftermath was chaotic. Parents demanded answers we couldn't give. Child psychologists were brought in to work with Ms. Vega's former students, many of whom were experiencing anxiety, nightmares, and what one therapist called intrusive precognitive thoughts. Emma Burke was hospitalized briefly after she became hysterical, claiming she could see the shadow people that Ms. Vega had shown them how to perceive. Slowly, over weeks of therapy and careful support, the children began to recover. The strange knowledge faded, the vision stopped, and they returned to being normal 8-year-olds. But they never forgot Ms. Vega, and neither did I. Sometimes, when I'm working late and the school is empty, I swear I can hear her voice through the walls, that low, hypnotic tone teaching impossible lessons to invisible students. The district implemented new screening procedures for substitutes, but I know it won't matter. Whatever Ms. Vega was, and I'm certain she wasn't entirely human, she's out there somewhere in another school with another group of innocent children. I've set up Google alerts for mysterious substitute teachers and unexplained student behaviors, watching for her pattern to emerge again. Last month, I got a hit from a small town in Montana. A substitute teacher with exceptional credentials, children exhibiting unusual knowledge, parents asking uncomfortable questions. The photo in the article was blurry, but I recognized those eyes. I contacted the school immediately, but by the time they investigated, she was gone again, leaving only confused children and corrupted records in her wake. I don't know what Ms. Vega wants or why she targets children. Maybe she feeds on their innocence, their untapped potential. Maybe she's recruiting them for something we can't understand. Or maybe she's just a predator of a different kind, one that hunts minds instead of bodies. All I know is that she's still out there, still teaching, still changing children in ways that violate everything we understand about reality. If you're a parent or teacher and a new substitute seems too good to be true, pay attention. Watch for children who suddenly know things they shouldn't, who speak of seeing beyond the veil of normal perception. Look for the signs I missed until it was almost too late. And if you encounter a woman with dark eyes that seem to hold infinite depths, who knows your secrets before you speak them, get your children away from her immediately. Some teachers shape minds. Ms. Vega reshapes reality itself, and the lessons she teaches can't be unlearned easily. The children in her class that spring have recovered, mostly, but sometimes I catch them staring at empty spaces with recognition in their eyes, seeing things the rest of us are blessed to miss. They were given a gift they never asked for, a sight beyond sight that no child should possess. I still teach 5th grade at Riverside Elementary. We have a new long-term substitute now, Mrs. Garcia, who's wonderfully normal and appropriately confused by children's behavior. But I watch every new teacher carefully, looking for signs, protecting my students from dangers the district guidelines could never anticipate. Because now I know that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the perfect teacher, arriving just when you need them most, offering everything you want while taking something you didn't know you could lose. The Midnight Uber Driver. My name is David, and I've been driving for Uber for about 3 years now, mostly nights and weekends to supplement my income from my day job at an insurance company. I've had my share of weird passengers, drunk college kids, people having emotional breakdowns, the occasional couple fighting in the back seat, but nothing that ever made me question my safety until last November. What happened during those 3 nights still makes me check my rearview mirror more than necessary and refuse certain rides that give me a bad feeling. It was the week before Thanksgiving, typically a busy time with people traveling and going to holiday parties. I was working the late shift from 10 p.m. to 3 a.m., picking up the bar crowd and late-night workers. The money was good, especially with surge pricing, and I'd been having a decent week until Thursday night when everything changed. The first pickup request came in around 11:30 p.m. from an address in a part of town I didn't usually service. Old industrial area with abandoned warehouses and few streetlights. The writer's name showed as M, just the initial, which wasn't unusual. Some people value their privacy. The pickup note said, "Gray building, red door. I'll be waiting outside." I almost canceled the ride. Something felt off about picking someone up from such a desolate area so late at night. But the fare was good, a 45-minute trip to the suburbs, and I needed the money for Christmas shopping. So I drove out there, telling myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably just someone working a late shift at one of the few operational businesses in the area. The building was exactly as described, gray concrete, probably from the 1960s, with a single red door illuminated by a flickering security light. A figure stood beneath it, hood up despite the relatively mild weather. As I pulled up, they immediately moved toward the car and I got my first real look at my passenger. M was tall, maybe 6 feet 2 inches, wearing all black with the hood shadowing their face. They moved with an odd fluidity, like a dancer or martial artist, controlled and precise. When they opened the back door and slid in, the dome light briefly illuminated their face, and I saw it was a woman, pale with sharp cheekbones and eyes that reflected the light like a cat's. "Good evening," she said, her voice low and cultured, with an accent I couldn't place. "I appreciate you accepting the ride. Not many drivers come out here." I gave my standard friendly greeting and confirmed the destination, a residential address in an upscale suburb. As I pulled away, I noticed she didn't have any bags or belongings, which seemed strange for such a long trip. Most people going that far at least had a phone out, but she sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. The first 10 minutes passed in silence. I'd learned to read passengers. Some want to chat, others prefer quiet, and she definitely seemed like the latter. But as we merged onto the highway, she spoke suddenly, making me jump slightly. "Do you enjoy driving at night, David?" I hadn't told her my name. It was on the app, sure, but most passengers didn't bother to look. "It's all right," I answered carefully. "Good money, usually peaceful." "Peaceful," she repeated as if tasting the word. "Yes, the night can be peaceful, but it can also reveal things hidden in daylight. Don't you find that true?" Her tone made me grip the steering wheel tighter. "I guess so. People do act different at night." "Not just people," she said softly, and I saw her reflection in the rearview mirror, smiling slightly. "Tell me, David, do you believe in predators?" The question was so unexpected I almost laughed. "Like animals?" "Sure, they exist." "No, not animals. Predators that hunt in cities, in crowds, hiding in plain sight. Predators that have evolved beyond the need for claws and fangs." I was starting to seriously regret taking this ride. I try not to think about stuff like that. Just focus on getting people where they need to go safely. She leaned forward slightly, and I caught a whiff of her perfume. Something floral but with an underlying metallic scent, like roses mixed with copper. "Safety is an illusion, David. We're all prey to something. The only question is whether we recognize the hunter before they strike." My hands were sweating now, making the steering wheel slick. I considered pulling over, making an excuse about car trouble, anything to get her out of my vehicle. But we were on a stretch of highway with no exits for miles, and something told me that stopping would be worse than continuing. "You're afraid," she observed, sounding amused. "Good. Fear keeps prey alive. But you needn't worry about me, David. I've already fed tonight." That statement hit me like ice water. I glanced in the mirror again and noticed dark stains on her black clothing that I hadn't seen before, and her hands, which I'd thought were just pale, had something dark under the fingernails. I think I need to stop for gas," I lied, my voice cracking. "No, you don't. Your tank is 3/4 full. Please continue driving, David. We're having such a pleasant conversation." The fact that she knew my fuel level made my blood run cold. I hadn't looked at the gauge since before picking her up. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. I could call 911, but what would I say? That my passenger was creepy? I could pull over anyway, but something told me that would trigger whatever she was planning. "You're thinking of ways to escape," she said, almost conversationally. "Calling for help, perhaps? Or maybe driving to a police station. I wouldn't recommend either. I simply need a ride, David. Complete the trip and you'll have an interesting story to tell. Complicate things and, well, stories require survivors to tell them." The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. She didn't speak again, but I could feel her watching me, studying my every movement. I focused on driving, on the normal mechanical actions of operating the vehicle, trying not to think about what she'd meant by "already fed tonight." As we neared the destination, she spoke again. "You've been very professional, David. I appreciate that. When you drop me off, you'll wait until I'm inside before leaving. You won't look at the house number or try to remember this address. You'll go home, delete this ride from your history if possible, and forget this happened. Do you understand?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Verbal confirmation, please." "I understand," I croaked. "Excellent. And David? I take this route every Thursday. Different drivers, usually, but occasionally repeats. If you see a request from them from that address again, I suggest you decline it. Not all my rides end as peacefully as this one. We pulled up to a large house set back from the road, hidden behind tall hedges. The driveway was long and curved, preventing me from seeing the actual building. She got out smoothly, then leaned back in before closing the door. "One more thing, David. That dashcam you have? It stopped working about 5 minutes into our ride. You'll find the footage is corrupted. Technology is so unreliable these days." She closed the door and walked up the driveway, disappearing into the shadows. I waited as instructed, though every instinct screamed at me to flee. After what felt like hours but was probably only a minute, a light came on in what I assumed was the house, and I took that as permission to leave. I drove home in a daze, running 2 red lights and nearly missing my exit. When I checked my dashcam at home, she was right. The file was corrupted, showing nothing but static from the moment she'd gotten in the car. The ride history in my app showed the pickup location as address unavailable, and the drop-off as just the suburb name, no specific address. I called in sick to my day job Friday and spent the day trying to convince myself it had been some elaborate prank or that I'd misunderstood her words. But deep down, I knew what I'd experienced was real. Someone, or something, that called itself M was using Uber to travel after feeding, and I'd been its unwitting accomplice. I took Saturday night off too, but by Sunday bills and rent demanded I get back to work. I drove cautiously, declining any rides from industrial areas and ending my shift by midnight. Everything was normal until around 11:45 p.m. when a request popped up. The name showed as M, pickup location in that same industrial area. I declined so fast I nearly dropped my phone. Immediately, another request came through, same name, same location. I declined again and decided to call it a night, driving home with my doors locked and checking the mirrors constantly. No one followed me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next Thursday, I purposely drove a different area, staying closer to downtown where there were always people around. But at 11:30 p.m. exactly, a request came through. Industrial area. I declined and immediately got a text through the app. "That's twice, David. There won't be a third opportunity to decline." I reported the message to Uber, but they found no record of it in their system. The support rep suggested I was experiencing a technical glitch and recommended I restart my phone. I didn't drive for a week after that, making excuses to my wife about being burned out, needing a break. When financial pressure forced me back to driving, I worked different hours, afternoon shifts and early evenings only. For a month, everything was fine. I started to relax, telling myself I'd imagined the threat, that M had found other drivers for her mysterious Thursday night rides. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in broad daylight, I got a pickup request from a regular residential area. The name showed as Mary, and I accepted without thinking. When I arrived, a perfectly normal-looking middle-aged woman got in, giving me a pleasant smile. "Hi, David," she said in that familiar cultured voice, and my blood turned to ice. It was her, but in daylight she looked completely different. Her hair was brown instead of black, her face rounder, her clothes suburban casual. Only the eyes were the same, reflecting too much light, holding too much knowledge. "I was disappointed when you stopped accepting my rides," she said conversationally as I numbly started driving to her listed destination, a shopping mall. "I thought we had an understanding." I was working different hours. I managed. Yes, I noticed. Very inconvenient. I had to make other arrangements, and they weren't nearly as professional as you. One driver even tried to film me. Can you imagine? He had to be corrected. My hands shook on the wheel. "What do you want?" "Simply a reliable driver, David. Someone discreet, professional, who understands the importance of not asking questions." "I thought you were that person, but then you started avoiding me." "I won't tell anyone," I whispered. "I haven't told anyone." "I know," she said, and somehow that was worse than if she doubted me. "That's why we're having this conversation instead of a different kind of interaction." We drove in silence for a few minutes before she spoke again. "I'll make you a deal, David. One Thursday a month you'll accept my ride request. Same pickup location, various drop-off points. You'll be well compensated. I always tip generously. In exchange, you'll have my protection." "Protection from what?" She smiled in the mirror. "From others like me. You'd be surprised how many predators use ride-sharing services. It's so convenient, so anonymous. But they'll know you're mine and they'll leave you alone. And if I refuse, then you'll just be another driver, David. unprotected, vulnerable, and eventually you'll pick up the wrong passenger on a dark night. Someone less civilized than me, less willing to have a conversation. I thought about my wife, my kids, my normal life that suddenly felt so fragile. Once a month. And David? Sometimes I'll have luggage. You won't ask about it, you won't look at it, and you certainly won't open it. I agreed. What choice did I have? That was 6 months ago. Since then, I've driven Em on the third Thursday of every month. She's always polite, always tips well, usually $200 cash, and never does anything overtly threatening. But I've noticed things. The industrial building where I pick her up has no signs, no visible business name. Sometimes there are other cars in the parking lot when I arrive, but never when we leave. And once, just once, I saw something dark dripping from the trunk of one of those cars. The luggage she mentioned has appeared 3 times. Heavy duffel bags that she loads herself, movements still fluid and controlled despite the obvious weight. They smell like copper and something chemical like industrial cleaner. I don't ask, I don't look, I just drive. Other drivers have started avoiding certain areas of town, whispering about passengers who gave them bad feelings, about colleagues who disappeared after taking rides to specific locations. I want to warn them, but what would I say? That I'm under the protection of something that might not be human? That I'm complicit in whatever Em does on those Thursday nights? Last week she gave me a card, black with just a phone number in silver ink. In case you ever need help, she said. Real help, not the kind police provide. Consider it a job benefit. I keep the card in my wallet, feeling its weight like a stone. I've thought about quitting driving altogether, but Em made it clear that our arrangement transcends my employment status. I have your address, David, she reminded me gently. Your family's addresses too. It's so much better when we maintain our professional relationship. So I drive. Every third Thursday, I pick up Em from that industrial building and take her wherever she needs to go. I don't ask questions when she returns smelling of blood. I don't comment when she mentions that the city's missing persons rate has decreased since she arrived. I just drive and I survive, and I try not to think about the cost of my protection. My wife thinks I've been acting strange lately, jumping at shadows, checking locks obsessively. She wants me to see a therapist, maybe get medication for anxiety. But how can I explain that my anxiety is justified? That there are things hunting in our city, using our technology to find prey, and I'm helping one of them? I've started seeing them elsewhere too. In restaurants, their eyes reflecting too much light. In grocery stores, moving with that same predatory grace. At my daughter's school concert, a new teacher who watched the children with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They're everywhere, hidden in plain sight, and now that I know what to look for, I can't unsee them. Sometimes Em talks during our rides, sharing glimpses of a world I wish I didn't know existed. She's mentioned territory disputes, hunting grounds, something called the compact, that keeps her kind from feeding too openly. Once she spoke of old ones, beings that were here before the cities, that adapted and evolved to hunt in urban environments. We're not the monsters from your fairy tales, she said. We're what monsters evolved into. I've considered going to the authorities, but with what evidence? Corrupted dashcam footage? A rider who tips too well? And even if they believed me, Em has made it clear that she's not alone. We're networked, David, she told me once. Just like your Uber drivers, but with better communication and much stricter consequences for breaking rules. So this is my life now. I drive regular passengers most nights, families going to airports, friends heading to parties, normal people living normal lives. But once a month, I drive a predator, and in exchange, the other predators leave me alone. I see them sometimes in my peripheral vision or in other cars at red lights, and they see me too. But they know I'm marked, claimed, protected by something they respect or fear. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know, even if they don't believe it. If something happens to me, if I disappear like those other drivers, at least there will be a record. But I don't think anything will happen. Em seems to value our arrangement, and as long as I remain useful, I'm safe. The worst part isn't the fear or the moral weight of enabling whatever Em does. The gratitude. Because in quiet moments, when I read about another driver going missing or see a news report about remains found in an abandoned building, I'm grateful it's not me. I'm grateful for Em's protection, for the card in my wallet, for the terrible knowledge that keeps me safe. I've become complicit in something monstrous to protect myself and my family. And the truly terrifying part? Given the choice again, knowing what I know now, I'd make the same decision. Because Em was right about one thing: we're all prey to something. The only question is whether we can negotiate with our predators or become their victims. Next Thursday is the third Thursday of the month. I'll be working the late shift, and at 11:30 p.m., a request will come through from Em at that industrial building. I'll accept it as I always do, and drive her wherever she needs to go. I won't ask about the blood. I won't wonder about the luggage. I'll just drive and survive and try to forget that monsters evolved to use apps just like the rest of us. If you're a night driver in any city, pay attention to your passengers. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. And if someone offers you protection in exchange for discretion, think carefully before refusing, because the alternatives are worse than complicity. I know that now. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep but too deadly to share. This is mine. Drive safely, and may you never have to make the choice I did. The mother's intuition. My name is Rebecca, and I'm a single mother of two beautiful children, Emma, who's 8, and little Marcus, who just turned 5 last month. We live in a cozy suburban neighborhood in Ohio, the kind where kids still ride bikes until the streetlights come on and neighbors actually know each other's names. It's the life I always dreamed of giving my children after their father left us 3 years ago, and for the most part, it's been everything I hoped for. But last summer, something happened that made me realize how a mother's worst nightmare can hide behind the most innocent facade. It started when the Andersons moved into the house 3 doors down from us. They seemed like the perfect family. Tom was a pediatrician at the local hospital, his wife Sarah worked from home as a graphic designer, and they had a 12-year-old son named Kyle who was polite, well-mannered, and eager to help with yard work. The neighborhood welcomed them with open arms, organizing a barbecue in their honor where Sarah's homemade potato salad was such a hit that everyone begged for the recipe. Kyle quickly became the neighborhood's favorite babysitter. He was responsible, great with younger kids, and always available. Parents loved that he didn't just park the kids in front of the TV but actually played games with them, read stories, and even helped with homework. His rates were reasonable, he always cleaned up after the kids, and he had that rare quality of making children feel special and heard. Within weeks, he had a steady stream of babysitting jobs, and parents were practically fighting over his availability for date nights. I was slower to warm up to the idea of Kyle babysitting my kids. Maybe it was because I'd been handling everything on my own for so long, or maybe it was just that protective instinct that kicks into overdrive when you're the only parent. But Emma started begging me to let Kyle babysit after hearing her friends rave about how fun he was, and eventually I caved. I needed to attend a work function that I couldn't miss, and my usual babysitter had canceled at the last minute. The first time Kyle babysat was perfect. I came home to find the house cleaner than I'd left it, both kids bathed and in their pajamas, and Emma excitedly telling me about the treasure hunt Kyle had organized in the backyard. Marcus, who was usually shy around new people, was drawing pictures of this super cool fort Kyle had helped them build with couch cushions. Kyle gave me a detailed report of everything they'd eaten when they'd brushed their teeth, and even mentioned that Emma had seemed worried about her upcoming spelling test, so he'd helped her practice. I was impressed and relieved. Finding reliable childcare as a single parent is like striking gold, and Kyle seemed like the answer to my prayers. I started using him regularly, maybe once a week, sometimes twice if I had to work late or wanted to grab dinner with my sister. The kids were always thrilled when they heard Kyle was coming over, and I felt like I could finally breathe a little easier knowing they were in good hands. But then small things started to change, so subtle at first that I almost missed them. Emma, my chatty, outgoing daughter who normally told me every detail of her day, became quieter after Kyle's visits. When I asked about their evening, she'd give short answers, "It was fine," or "We just played games," and quickly changed the subject. I attributed it to her getting older, maybe entering that phase where everything Mom asked was annoying. Marcus started having nightmares, waking up crying about the game where you have to be very still. When I asked him about it, he'd get this distant look in his eyes and say Kyle told him it was a secret game that only special kids got to play. That should have been my first real red flag, but Kyle explained it away so smoothly when I asked. It was just a variation of freeze tag to help calm the kids down before bed. His explanation made perfect sense, and I felt silly for being worried. The changes in my children were gradual but undeniable. Emma started insisting on wearing long sleeves even in the heat of summer, claiming she was cold all the time. She'd flinch when I reached out to braid her hair or hug her goodbye. Marcus became clingy in a way he'd never been before, following me from room to room and having meltdowns when I had to leave for work. Both kids started asking more frequently if I really had to go out, if Kyle really had to come over. The turning point came on a humid Thursday evening in July. I was supposed to attend a company dinner, but something felt wrong from the moment I started getting ready. Call it mother's intuition or just the accumulation of all those little warning signs, but I felt this heavy dread in my stomach that made my hands shake as I applied my lipstick. Emma watched me from my bedroom doorway, not saying anything, just staring with those big brown eyes that looked far too worried for an 8-year-old. "Mom," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if you get sick at dinner and have to come home early?" It was such an odd, specific question that I stopped what I was doing and really looked at her. "Why would I get sick, sweetheart?" She shrugged, picking at a hangnail until it bled. "I don't know. Sometimes people get sick suddenly. Then they have to come home, even if they're not supposed to." Looking back, I realized she was trying to tell me something without actually telling me. Kids do that when they've been told to keep secrets, when they're scared of getting in trouble or not being believed. They drop hints and hope the adults in their lives are paying attention. Thank God I was paying attention that night. I made a decision that probably saved my children. I called my boss, faked a sudden migraine, and sent my apologies for missing the dinner. But I didn't tell Kyle the dinner was canceled. Instead, I left the house as usual, drove around the block, and parked where I could see my house but wouldn't be easily spotted. I felt ridiculous, like some paranoid helicopter parent, but that maternal instinct was screaming at me that something was wrong. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. I could see the flicker of the TV through the living room windows, occasional movement as someone walked past. I was starting to feel foolish, sitting in my car spying on my own house, when I noticed Kyle's parents' car pull up. That was strange. They'd never come over during his babysitting jobs before. Tom and Sarah Anderson got out, but they didn't go to the front door. Instead, they walked around to the back of the house where I couldn't see them. My heart started racing. Why would Kyle's parents be sneaking into my backyard? I waited 5 agonizing minutes, then couldn't stand it anymore. I got out of my car and crept toward my house, staying in the shadows. As I got closer, I could hear voices from the backyard, adult voices speaking in low, urgent tones. I couldn't make out the words, but something about the rhythm of the conversation made my skin crawl. I remembered the spare key hidden under the ceramic frog by the back door and made my way there, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. The back door was already unlocked. I slipped inside, grateful I'd spent years learning which floorboards creaked and how to move silently through my own home, skills you develop when you have young children you don't want to wake. I could hear voices more clearly now, coming from the basement. We barely used our basement just for storage and the washer/dryer. Why would they be down there? I crept to the basement door, which was cracked open just enough for me to peer through. What I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. My children were sitting on the concrete floor in their pajamas, both eerily still, their eyes vacant and unfocused. Kyle was kneeling in front of them, holding Marcus's small hands in his, while his parents stood behind him with camera equipment, professional-looking cameras with special lighting. "You're doing so well," Kyle was saying to Marcus in a soothing voice that made me want to vomit. "Such a special boy. Remember, this is our secret game. Good children don't tell secrets." Sarah Anderson was adjusting the camera angle and I heard her say, "We need to hurry. She usually doesn't stay out past 10. "Relax," Tom replied. "Kyle said she's never come home early before. We have time to get what we need." I wanted to burst through that door and tear my children away from them, but some primitive protective instinct made me pull out my phone instead. I needed evidence. I needed to make sure these monsters couldn't just disappear and do this to other children. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone steady as I recorded through the crack in the door. "Emma, sweetheart," Kyle was saying now, "show me again how you're such a good secret keeper. Show Mom and Dad how well you can pose." My daughter moved robotically, positioning herself as Kyle directed, and I had to bite my hand to keep from screaming. I'd seen enough. I backed away from the door and called 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher about intruders in my home with my children. Then I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I waited. Every instinct screamed at me to protect my babies, but I knew if I confronted 3 adults alone, I might not be able to save them. The police arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. I met them at the front door, trying to convey the urgency without alerting the people in my basement. The officers moved swiftly and professionally, and the next few minutes were a blur of shouts, crying children, and the Andersons being led away in handcuffs, their expensive camera equipment tagged as evidence. Emma and Marcus were physically unharmed but deeply traumatized. The full story came out slowly, through gentle interviews with child psychologists and specialists. The Andersons were part of a child exploitation ring, using their son to gain access to children. Kyle had been grooming my kids for weeks, using games and rewards to normalize inappropriate behavior and ensure their silence. The secret games had been escalating, and that night was apparently when they planned to create content for their sick network. The investigation revealed they'd done this before in 2 other states, always moving when suspicion arose, always using their respectability as shields. Tom's position as a pediatrician had given him access to vulnerable families, and they particularly targeted single parents who might be desperate for reliable childcare. My children weren't their first victims, but thanks to that maternal instinct that wouldn't let me ignore the warning signs, they were their last. The legal process was exhausting and re-traumatizing. The kids had to testify, reliving their experiences in child-friendly courtroom settings. I held their hands and promised them over and over that they were brave, that they'd done nothing wrong, that the bad people would never hurt them again. The Andersons were all convicted, even Kyle, who was tried as an adult, and received lengthy prison sentences. But justice doesn't erase trauma. We moved away from that neighborhood, unable to drive past that house without remembering. I found us a new home in a different school district, somewhere we could start fresh. Both kids underwent extensive therapy, and slowly, painfully, they began to heal. Emma started talking again, really talking, not just giving surface answers. Marcus's nightmares faded, replaced by normal 5-year-old dreams about dinosaurs and superheroes. But I changed too. That night shattered my faith in the world's safety, made me realize how evil can wear such a friendly face. I became the mom who runs background checks on everyone, who asks for references and actually calls them, who trusts her gut even when logic says she's being paranoid. Some might say I'm overprotective now, but those people haven't seen their children's innocence nearly stolen by monsters pretending to be pillars of the community. I share this story not to frighten other parents but to empower them. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Don't let politeness or social pressure override your protective instincts. Ask your children open-ended questions about their time with caregivers. Watch for changes in behavior, no matter how subtle. Create an environment where your kids know they can tell you anything, even secrets they've been told to keep. Most importantly, know that predators rarely look like predators. They look like helpful neighbors, respected professionals, polite teenagers eager to earn babysitting money. They groom not just children but entire communities, building trust and respectability that they use as weapons against the vulnerable. They count on our desire to see the best in people, to give the benefit of the doubt, to not make waves. My children are healing. Emma just started middle school and made the honor roll. Marcus is obsessed with soccer and rarely stops moving long enough to remember he was ever afraid. They're going to be okay because we caught it in time, because I listened to that voice inside me that said something was wrong. Not all children are so lucky. If you're a parent reading this, please remember, you are your child's first and last line of defense. Don't ignore the warning signs. Don't talk yourself out of concern because someone seems nice or comes recommended. And please teach your children that no adult should ever ask them to keep secrets from their parents, that their bodies belong to them, and that they will never be in trouble for telling you if someone makes them uncomfortable. The Andersons are in prison, but there are others out there looking for vulnerable families, gaining trust, waiting for opportunities. Be vigilant. Be protective. And never, ever apologize for following your instincts when it comes to your children's safety. That paranoid feeling might just save their lives. The overnight security guard. My name is Jamal, and I've worked security for over 15 years at various sites around Atlanta. I've done everything from mall security to corporate buildings, dealt with shoplifters and drunk businessmen, even had a knife pulled on me once by a guy trying to steal copper wire from a construction site. I thought I'd seen it all, developed a thick skin and good instincts for trouble. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened during my brief stint at the Riverside Medical Research Facility last winter. I should have known something was off from the interview itself. The pay was too good, nearly double what overnight security usually made. The HR manager, a nervous woman who kept checking her phone and glancing at the door, rushed through the questions like she couldn't wait to get out of there. When I asked about the facility's research, she gave me a vague answer about medical advancement and quickly changed the subject. But I needed the money badly. My daughter Keisha was starting college in the fall, and every extra dollar counted. The facility itself looked normal enough from the outside, a modern 5-story building with reflective glass windows, surrounded by a well-maintained parking lot and decorative landscaping. During my first night orientation, the outgoing guard, an older man named Carl, gave me the tour with the enthusiasm of someone counting the minutes until retirement. He showed me the security office, the camera monitors, the keycard access points, and handed me a thick manual of protocols. Most important rule, Carl said, his hands trembling slightly as he pointed to a section highlighted in red: never, under any circumstances, go to the 4th floor after midnight. Security isn't authorized for that floor during those hours. What's on the 4th floor? I asked, naturally curious. Carl's face went pale, and he glanced at the cameras showing the 4th floor hallway empty, sterile, fluorescent lit. Research labs. Special projects. Just don't go up there after midnight. Do your rounds on every other floor but skip 4. They have their own security protocols up there. I wanted to press for more information, but something in Carl's eyes stopped me. It wasn't just fear, it was the exhausted look of someone who'd given up trying to make sense of something. He finished the orientation quickly, handed me the keys and access cards, and practically ran to his car. I watched him drive away and felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach. The first few nights were quiet, almost boring. I did my rounds every 2 hours, checking doors, scanning my card at the required checkpoints, filling out the logbook. The building was eerily quiet after the day staff left at 6, just the hum of ventilation systems and the occasional beep from medical equipment. I spent most of my time in the security office watching monitors, catching up on books, trying not to fall asleep. But I noticed things. Small things at first. The 4th floor camera feeds would sometimes flicker with static after midnight, just for a second or two. I'd hear sounds through the ventilation system. Not quite voices, not quite machinery, but something in between. Once, around 2 a.m., all the lights on the 4th floor went out simultaneously, plunging the hallway into darkness for exactly 13 minutes before flickering back on. I dutifully logged these incidents, but no one ever followed up. It was during my second week that I first saw Dr. Chen. She appeared on the 1st floor camera at 11:47 p.m., using her keycard to enter through the main entrance. She was a small woman, maybe mid-40s, wearing a lab coat over business clothes and carrying a metal briefcase that seemed too heavy for her frame. She walked with purpose to the elevator, and I watched her punch the button for the 4th floor. I glanced at the clock, 13 minutes until midnight. According to the protocols, she was cutting it close. I continued watching the monitors, expecting to see her appear on the 4th floor camera. But she didn't. The elevator doors opened to an empty hallway. I cycled through all the 4th floor cameras, but there was no sign of Dr. Chen anywhere. At exactly midnight, the 4th floor cameras went completely black. Not static, not darkness, just dead feeds showing nothing. My training said to log it and ignore it, but something made me leave the security office and walk to the elevator bay. All the elevator displays showed the cars at rest on the ground floor, but I could hear machinery somewhere above, the unmistakable sound of an elevator in motion. I returned to the security office, unsettled but trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe there were areas on the 4th floor without camera coverage. Maybe Dr. Chen had immediately entered a lab outside the camera's view. But then, at 12:43 a.m., she appeared again on the 1st floor camera, exiting the elevator. The metal briefcase was gone, and her lab coat was stained with something dark. She moved differently, too hunched, favoring her left side, one hand pressed against her ribs. She left through the main entrance without looking back. The 4th floor cameras flickered back on at 12:44 a.m., showing the same empty hallway as before. But now I noticed something I'd missed earlier. The floor had a subtle shine to it, like it had just been mopped. I zoomed in on one section and saw what looked like droplets of something dark near one of the lab doors, but the image quality wasn't good enough to be certain. I started paying closer attention after that night. Dr. Chen came 3 times a week, always arriving just before midnight, always carrying that same metal briefcase, always emerging sometime after 12:30 a.m. without it. Other people came, 2 men and women in lab coats or suits, all with the same pattern. Arrive before midnight, disappear on the 4th floor, emerge looking shaken or injured, always without whatever they'd brought with them. My breaking point came during my 3rd week. It was a particularly cold Thursday night, the kind where the building's heating system struggled to keep up. I was doing my 2 a.m. rounds, carefully skipping the 4th floor as always, when I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was like singing but wrong. Multiple voices harmonizing in pitches that human throats shouldn't be able to produce, coming from directly above me on the 4th floor. I stood frozen in the 3rd floor hallway, listening to that impossible song. It was beautiful and terrible, making my chest ache with a longing I couldn't name. Then abruptly it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the singing. I heard a door slam, running footsteps, and then a scream not of fear but of profound grief, like someone had lost everything they'd ever loved. I ran back to the security office and locked the door, my hands shaking as I grabbed my phone to call. Who? The police? And tell them what? That I heard strange singing? I sat there, paralyzed by indecision, when movement on the monitors caught my eye. The 4th floor cameras were showing something impossible. The hallway wasn't empty anymore. Figures moved through it, but they were wrong, too tall, joints bending in directions that made my eyes water. They seemed to phase in and out of visibility, one moment solid, the next translucent. And leading them, clearly visible, was Dr. Chen. But it couldn't be Dr. Chen because I'd logged her exit 2 hours ago. This Dr. Chen moved with fluid grace, her feet not quite touching the floor, and when she turned toward the camera, her eyes were points of light that pierced through the screen. The footage lasted maybe 30 seconds before all the 4th floor cameras died again. When they came back on, the hallway was empty, pristine, no evidence of what I'd witnessed. I sat in that office until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to continue my rounds, afraid of what else I might see. When the day staff started arriving at 6 a.m., I practically ran to my car. I called in sick the next night and the night after that. On the 3rd day, I got a call from HR. The same nervous woman from my interview, but now her voice was different, cold, professional, with an undertone of threat. Mr. Washington, she said, we're concerned about your sudden illness. You seemed so reliable during your interview. I'm sorry, I stammered. I need to find different employment. This isn't working out. There was a long pause. That's unfortunate. We hate to lose good employees. Tell me, has anything about your position troubled you? Any unusual observations you'd like to report? Every instinct screamed at me to lie. No, ma'am. It's just the overnight schedule. It's harder than I expected at my age. I see. She didn't sound convinced. Well, if you're certain, we'll need you to return your access cards and sign some additional paperwork regarding your separation. Standard NDA forms, you understand. Can you come by this afternoon? I agreed, though every part of me wanted to mail the cards and never set foot in that building again. That afternoon, I met with HR and signed a stack of papers without really reading them, focused only on getting out of there. The NDA was comprehensive. I couldn't discuss anything I'd seen or heard during my employment, couldn't reference the facility on social media, couldn't even list it on my resume without permission. As I handed over my access cards, the HR woman smiled tightly. We appreciate your discretion, Mr. Washington. Some things are better left unexamined, don't you think? For everyone's safety. The threat was clear. I nodded, took my final paycheck, which included a surprisingly generous severance, and left. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, couldn't shake the sound of that inhuman singing. I started researching the facility online, but found almost nothing. Their website was bare bones, full of corporate speak about advancing medical knowledge and pioneering treatments. No employee directories, no published research, no news articles. I did find one thing buried in a local history forum. A post from 3 years ago by someone claiming their sister had worked at Riverside Medical Research before disappearing. According to the post, the sister had been a researcher who'd become increasingly paranoid, talking about volunteers who couldn't leave and treatments that changed more than disease. The post had no responses and the account had been deleted. 2 months after I quit, I saw Dr. Chen at a grocery store. At least I thought it was her. Same height, same general features, but something was off. She moved through the aisles with that same flowing grace I'd seen on the 4th floor cameras, never quite touching anything, items seeming to jump into her basket on their own. When she passed me, she paused, turning those 2 bright eyes in my direction. Mr. Washington, she said, though I'd never told her my name during our brief encounters. How nice to see you looking so well. Still having trouble sleeping? I hadn't told anyone about the nightmares that had plagued me since leaving the facility. I'm fine, I managed. She smiled, and for just a moment I saw too many teeth. Good. Sleep is so important. You never know what might visit in those vulnerable hours. Take care of yourself. She glided away, leaving me standing frozen by the produce section. When I finally gathered the courage to follow her path, she was gone. The cashiers claimed no one matching her description had come through their lines. I moved my family out of state 6 months later, using Keisha's college acceptance as an excuse. We're in a small town in North Carolina now, far from any medical research facilities. I work day security at a normal office building where the biggest excitement is someone forgetting their keycard. I sleep better, though I still wake sometimes at midnight, listening for singing that never comes. But I know it's still happening. Whatever they're doing on that 4th floor, whoever or whatever they're creating or summoning or transforming, it continues. Sometimes I think about the people who enter that building just before midnight, carrying their metal briefcases full of God knows what, emerging broken and changed. I think about the things I saw moving in that hallway, defying physics and reason. I think about Dr. Chen and others like her walking among us, not quite human anymore. The severance money paid for Keisha's first year of college. Blood money, I suppose, buying my silence about things that shouldn't exist. But what could I do? Who would believe me? And even if they did, what force on earth could stop what's happening in that building? Some knowledge is too dangerous to share, some truths too terrible to expose. If you're ever offered a security job that pays too well, with rules that don't make sense in areas you're forbidden to patrol, think twice. The money isn't worth what you'll see, what you'll know, what will follow you home in your dreams. Some doors should stay closed, some floors should remain unguarded, and some songs should never reach human ears. I still dream about that singing sometimes, those impossible harmonies that made my soul ache with beauty and terror. In my dreams, I take the elevator to the 4th floor, walk down that pristine hallway and open one of those lab doors. But I always wake before I see what's inside. Part of me is grateful for that. The other part, the part that will never fully leave that building, desperately wants to know what could make inhuman voices sing with such perfect, terrible joy. The church organist. My name is Eleanor, and I've been playing organ for churches since I was 16 years old. Music has always been my calling, my way of connecting with the divine and sharing that connection with others. For 37 years, I've sat at organ benches in sanctuaries across the Midwest, filling sacred spaces with hymns and preludes, accompanying congregations as they lift their voices in worship. But what happened at St. Bartholomew's last winter tested not just my faith, but my understanding of what music can do when it falls into the wrong hands. St. Bartholomew's was a small Episcopal church in rural Illinois, one of those picturesque stone buildings that looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. The congregation was aging and dwindling, maybe 30 regulars on a good Sunday, but they were devoted and welcoming. When their longtime organist passed away suddenly, they reached out to me through diocesan connections. The pay was modest, but they offered housing in the church's rectory, and after my recent divorce, I needed both the income and the fresh start. I arrived in late September when the trees were turning gold and the air had that crystalline quality that makes everything seem more beautiful than it really is. The rectory was a small cottage behind the church, cozy and well-maintained, with windows that looked directly at the church's bell tower. Father Michael, the priest, was a kind man in his 70s who seemed relieved to have found someone willing to relocate to their tiny town. The organ at St. Bartholomew's was magnificent, a 3-manual pipe organ built in 1898, lovingly maintained over the decades. The moment I placed my hands on those ivory keys and felt the rumble of the pedals beneath my feet, I knew I'd made the right decision. The acoustics in the stone sanctuary were perfect, each note hanging in the air like incense before fading into sacred silence. My first few months were peaceful, almost idyllic. I played for Sunday services, Wednesday evening prayer, and the occasional funeral or wedding. The congregation was appreciative, often staying after services to compliment my playing or share stories about their former organist, Mrs. Henderson. Between services, I practiced for hours, working through Bach fugues and discovering the organ's unique voice, learning which stops created which colors of sound. It was during one of these practice sessions in November that I first found it. I was reorganizing the cluttered organ bench, sorting through decades of accumulated sheet music, when I discovered a leather-bound volume wedged behind stacks of yellowed hymnals. It was handwritten, the musical notation precise but archaic, with Latin text I couldn't immediately translate. The cover bore no title, just a symbol that looked like interlocking circles with crosses at the cardinal points. Curiosity got the better of me. I propped the book on the music stand and played through the first piece, a simple melody that seemed almost medieval in structure. The music was hauntingly beautiful, with unexpected harmonic progressions that created colors I'd never heard from the organ before. As I played, the late afternoon sun slanted through the stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on the walls, and I felt a deep sense of peace, of connection to something ancient and profound. I began incorporating pieces from the leather book into my preludes and postludes. The congregation seemed to respond positively. Several people commented on the new music, saying it made them feel more contemplative, more open. Father Michael asked about the unfamiliar melodies and I showed him the book. He studied it with interest but admitted his Latin was rusty and he couldn't make sense of the texts. Everything changed on the first Sunday of Advent. I'd chosen a particularly complex piece from the leather book for the prelude, one that required all 3 manuals and intricate pedal work. As I played, I noticed something odd. The sanctuary seemed to be growing darker despite the morning sun streaming through the windows. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. But it was the music itself that was truly strange. Notes I wasn't playing began to emerge from the pipes, harmonies that shouldn't have been possible with only 2 hands and 2 feet. The organ seemed to be playing itself, adding voices and counter melodies that transformed the piece into something far more complex than what was written on the page. I tried to stop, to lift my hands from the keys, but my muscles wouldn't respond. I was trapped, forced to continue playing as the music built to an almost unbearable crescendo. When the piece finally ended, the sanctuary was in chaos. Half the congregation was weeping uncontrollably, while others sat frozen in their pews, staring at something I couldn't see. Mrs. Patterson, a stalwart member who'd never missed a Sunday in 40 years, was speaking rapidly in a language I didn't recognize. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Young Timothy Brown, the altar boy, had fallen to his knees and was drawing symbols on the floor with his finger, symbols that matched the one on the cover of the leather book. Father Michael managed to restore some order, leading the congregation in prayer and dismissing the service early. As people filed out, many seemed dazed, unable to remember what had happened. Others whispered about visions, some beautiful, some terrifying. Mrs. Patterson had no memory of speaking in tongues, and Timothy couldn't explain the symbols he'd drawn, which had somehow left marks on the stone floor despite his using only his finger. That night, Father Michael came to the rectory. He looked exhausted, older than his years, and his hands shook as he accepted the tea I offered. "Eleanor," he said carefully, "I need to know more about that music book. Where exactly did you find it?" I told him about discovering it in the organ bench, and he nodded slowly. "I've been making some calls," he said, "speaking with some of the older parishioners, looking through church records. It seems Mrs. Henderson found that same book about 5 years ago. She played from it too, but stopped abruptly. Told people the music was too powerful, whatever that meant. Shortly after, she began showing signs of dementia, though she'd been sharp as a tack before." A chill ran down my spine. "You think the music caused her dementia?" "I don't know what to think," Father Michael admitted, "but I found something else. That symbol on the cover? It appears in records from the church's founding in 1854. There were incidents. The original organist was found dead at the console, apparently having played continuously for 3 days without food or water. His successor went mad, claiming the organ was a gateway, that the music could thin the veil between worlds. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as superstition, but I couldn't forget the feeling of my hands moving against my will, the impossible harmonies, the darkness that had descended on the sanctuary. "What do you want me to do?" "Stop playing from that book," he said firmly. "In fact, I think we should lock it away, or better yet, destroy it." I agreed, but that night I couldn't sleep. The melodies from the leather book played in my head, note perfect, as if the music had written itself into my memory. I found myself at the rectory's small piano at 3 a.m., my fingers moving of their own accord, playing those haunting progressions. The music seemed to pull at something deep inside me, promising knowledge, transcendence, connection to something vast and eternal. The next Sunday, I played only traditional hymns, but the organ rebelled. Notes bent and warped, familiar melodies transforming into echoes of the forbidden music. The congregation grew restless, and I saw several people crying silently, though they seemed unaware of their tears. During the recessional hymn, the organ suddenly fell silent mid-phrase, though I was still playing. Then, from deep within the pipes, came a sound like breathing, like something enormous drawing breath before speaking. I fled the console, leaving the service unfinished. Father Michael found me in the rectory hours later, huddled under blankets, shaking uncontrollably. "It wants to be played," I whispered. "The music wants to be heard. It's alive somehow, living in the pipes, in the air, in my head." He made the decision to close the church temporarily, citing necessary repairs. A specialist was called in to examine the organ, but he found nothing mechanically wrong. However, he did discover something disturbing. Many of the pipes had been inscribed with symbols matching those in the leather book, etchings that seemed far older than the organ itself. When he tried to photograph them, his camera malfunctioned, and the images came out showing not pipes but what looked like reaching hands or tentacles. I tried to leave, to pack my things and flee, but the music wouldn't let me go. Every time I reached the town limits, I'd black out and wake up back at the organ console, my fingers on the keys, the leather book open before me. The episodes grew worse. I'd lose hours, sometimes entire days, coming to awareness in the middle of playing, the sanctuary filled with impossible sounds and shadows that moved independently of any light source. Father Michael brought in help from the diocese, a younger priest named Father James who specialized in what he carefully called unusual spiritual situations. He was skeptical at first until he witnessed one of my involuntary performances. I watched his face change from doubt to horror as the organ produced sounds no earthly instrument should make, whispers in dead languages, screams that seemed to come from far away, and underneath it all, that breathing as if the church itself had become a living thing. "This isn't possession in any traditional sense," Father James told us afterward, his academic composure shattered. "It's more like infection. The music is a kind of virus, spreading from the written page to the instrument to the performer. And I think it's been here much longer than the church itself." He'd done research on the land where St. Bartholomew stood. Before the church, there'd been a meeting house that burned down in mysterious circumstances. Before that, indigenous peoples had considered the area taboo, a place where the barrier between worlds was dangerously thin. The music, Father James theorized, was both a key and a beacon, unlocking something that should remain closed while calling to forces better left undisturbed. We tried everything. The leather book was locked in the church safe, but the music had already escaped, living in the organ's pipes and in my infected mind. They brought in another organist, but she fell under the music's influence within minutes, her trained fingers suddenly playing melodies she'd never learned. We tried having services without music, but the organ would play itself, soft and insidious, drawing people into the sanctuary at all hours. The breaking point came on Christmas Eve. I hadn't slept properly in weeks, sustained by the terrible energy the music provided. I looked like a skeleton, my hair falling out, my fingers bent and swollen from endless playing. But I couldn't stop. The music demanded to be played, and it was growing stronger, more complex, requiring not just my hands but my entire being as a conduit. That night, the church was packed for midnight mass. Families who attended only on Christmas, children home from college, the faithful and the merely traditional all gathered in the candlelit sanctuary. I tried to warn them, begged Father Michael to cancel the service, but the music's compulsion was too strong. I found myself at the console, the leather book open to a piece I'd never seen before, titled simply Adventus, The Arrival. As I began to play, the candles throughout the church flared simultaneously, their flames reaching impossibly high before settling into colors that shouldn't exist, purples that hurt to look at, greens that seemed to move independently, blues that whispered of ocean depths no human had ever seen. The music built in layers, each manual adding voices that weren't quite organ tones, weren't quite human voices, weren't quite anything that belonged in our world. The congregation began to change. Some aged visibly, their hair whitening, skin wrinkling as if decades were passing in moments. Others grew younger, becoming children, then infants, then something before birth that made my eyes water to perceive. A few simply ceased to be, fading like morning mist, leaving only their clothes in the pews. But worst were those who transformed into something else entirely, their bodies stretching and contorting, extra limbs sprouting, eyes multiplying, mouths opening in places mouths shouldn't be. Through it all, I played, my consciousness split between horror at what I was witnessing and ecstasy at the music itself. This was what all those years of practice had prepared me for, not Bach or Beethoven, but this cosmic symphony that used human suffering as percussion and transformed flesh as melody. I was no longer Eleanor the church organist. I was an instrument myself, played by forces that had waited centuries for this moment. The sanctuary walls began to buckle and breathe, stone becoming organic, pulsing in rhythm with the music. The stained glass windows showed not saints but things that had never been human, their stories told in colors that revealed too much about the true nature of reality. And above it all, through it all, that breathing grew louder, closer, as if something massive was pushing through from somewhere else, using the music as a bridge between worlds. It was Father Michael who saved us, though it cost him everything. As I reached the climax of Adventus, as reality itself threatened to tear like tissue paper, he staggered to the organ console. His face was ancient now, his body failing, but his faith remained strong. With the last of his strength, he pulled the main power switch, cutting electricity to the organ's blowers. The music stopped mid-phrase, the silence so absolute it was like a physical blow. The transformations halted, reversed, people screaming as they returned to their original forms. The breathing sound grew angry, desperate, then faded as whatever had been trying to enter our world was forced back. The sanctuary shuddered once, twice, then was still. In the aftermath, most had no clear memory of what had occurred. Official reports blamed a gas leak for the mass hallucination, though that didn't explain the physical evidence, the aged photographs in people's pockets, the impossible frost patterns on the windows, the fact that 3 people remained missing entirely. Father Michael survived but never fully recovered, spending his remaining months in a care facility, mumbling prayers in languages that predated Christianity. The church was deconsecrated and demolished within the year. They said it was structural damage, but I knew the truth. The building itself had been contaminated, infected by music that should never have been played. The organ was supposed to be destroyed, but I heard rumors it had been moved in the night, taken to some warehouse where collectors of the occult pay fortunes for artifacts touched by otherworldly forces. I've never played again. My fingers, once so nimble on the keys, now shake uncontrollably whenever I'm near any musical instrument. The music is still in my head, every note perfect, every harmony clear, but I dare not give it voice. I work in a library now, in a town far from any churches, surrounding myself with silence and the written word that can't betray me the way musical notation did. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, organ music drifting on the wind from no discernible source. It's playing somewhere, in some church or concert hall where they don't know what they've invited in. The music is patient. It waited centuries in that leather book, and it will wait centuries more if necessary. Each time it's played, it grows stronger, reaches further, pulls harder at the cosmic boundaries that keep our fragile reality intact. If you're a musician and you find old music in forgotten places, be careful what you choose to play. Some melodies are prayers, some are mathematics, and some are invitations to things that view our world as nothing more than a concert hall to be conquered. The music at St. Bartholomew's was all 3, and it very nearly succeeded in its terrible purpose. I still dream of that Christmas Eve service, of the moment when our congregation became a doorway. In my nightmares, I'm back at the console, playing that cosmic symphony while reality dissolves around me. But sometimes, in the worst dreams, I don't wake up when Father Michael pulls the switch. Sometimes the music completes its purpose, and I see what was trying to come through, vast and ancient and absolutely alien, using our transformed bodies as stepping stones into a world it had been locked out of since before human memory began. Those are the nights I'm grateful for my ruined hands, for the trembling that makes playing impossible. Because deep down, beneath the horror and the trauma, part of me wants to play again. Part of me misses the feeling of being a conduit for something greater than human understanding. And that terrifies me more than any cosmic horror ever could, the knowledge that given the chance, I might sit down at an organ again and willingly play the music that could end everything we know. The leather book was never found after the church's demolition. Sometimes I wonder if it's waiting in another organ bench in another small church, for another curious musician to discover its secret songs. If you're that musician, if you're reading this, please leave it closed. Some music is meant to remain unheard. Some harmonies are too perfect for human ears, and some instruments are better left silent than used as gateways for things that breathe between the notes. The Birthday Party Massacre. My name is Sandra, and I used to love planning birthday parties for my daughter. Used to. Before last March, when Lily turned 7 and I learned that some celebrations can become nightmares, that sometimes the people we trust with our children's joy can harbor darkness so profound it defies understanding. I'm sharing this story because other parents need to understand that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives with balloon animals and a painted smile. Lily had been talking about her 7th birthday for months. She wanted a princess party, but not just any princess party. She wanted Princess Anastasia, a character from her favorite obscure fairy tale book about a princess who could talk to butterflies. I'd searched everywhere for Princess Anastasia decorations, coming up empty, until I found a party planning service called Magical Moments that specialized in custom-themed parties. The owner, Mrs. Delacroix, was a godsend. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, she listened to Lily's very specific requests and promised to create the perfect Princess Anastasia party. Her portfolio was impressive, elaborate parties with handmade decorations, professional entertainers, and details that showed real care and attention. The prices were reasonable, almost too reasonable for the level of service, but she explained she did it for the love of seeing children happy. We met several times to plan the party. Mrs. Delacroix brought fabric samples for the princess costume, sketches of butterfly decorations, even a mock-up of a butterfly crown for the birthday girl. Lily was instantly smitten, chattering excitedly about every detail. Mrs. Delacroix seemed genuinely delighted by my daughter's enthusiasm, often bringing little butterfly stickers or coloring pages as surprises during our meetings. She introduced us to the entertainer who would play Princess Anastasia, a young woman named Rosalie who looked like she'd stepped out of a storybook. Porcelain skin, long auburn hair, movements that were graceful and otherworldly. When she spoke to Lily in character, my daughter's eyes went wide with wonder. Even I found myself charmed by the soft, melodious voice and the way she made the fantasy seem real. The party was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at our home. We'd invited 12 children from Lily's class, and Mrs. Delacroix arrived early that morning with her team to transform our backyard into a butterfly kingdom. They worked with remarkable efficiency, hanging gossamer fabrics from the trees, setting up activity stations, creating a throne made of flowers for the birthday princess. By noon, our ordinary suburban backyard looked like something from a dream. The other parents dropped their children off, most staying just long enough to admire the decorations and chat briefly. A few mentioned how lucky we were to find such an amazing party service. I beamed with pride, watching Lily race around in her butterfly crown, already declaring it the best birthday ever before the party had officially begun. Rosalie arrived in full Princess Anastasia costume, and the children gasped collectively. She looked even more magical than during our meeting. Her dress seemed to shimmer with colors that shifted like butterfly wings, and delicate antennae nestled in her elaborate hairdo. She carried a golden basket filled with small wrapped gifts, promising each child would receive a special butterfly blessing. The first hour was perfect. Rosalie led the children in games, teaching them the butterfly dance, and telling stories about the butterfly kingdom. Mrs. Delacroix and her assistants managed activities at various stations: face painting, crown making, a nectar drink station with colorful juices. I took dozens of photos, capturing Lily's pure joy, already planning the photo album I'd make to commemorate this magical day. It was during the butterfly ceremony that things began to feel wrong. Rosalie gathered the children in a circle, placing Lily in the center on her flower throne. She began to sing in a language I didn't recognize. Mrs. Delacroix had mentioned it would be a special butterfly summoning song in the fictional language of the Butterfly Kingdom. The melody was haunting, unlike any children's song I'd heard, with notes that seemed to resonate in my chest. The children swayed slightly, their eyes growing unfocused. I started to move forward, concerned, but Mrs. Delacroix placed a gentle hand on my arm. "It's part of the show," she whispered. "Watch, this is where the magic happens." Rosalie opened her golden basket and began pulling out what I'd assumed were toy butterflies. But as she tossed them into the air, they moved, fluttered. Beautiful butterflies in impossible colors filled the air, dancing around the circle of mesmerized children. My rational mind said they must be some kind of advanced animatronics, but they moved too naturally, their wings catching the light in ways that made my eyes water. The children began to speak, but not in their normal voices. They recited words in that same unknown language, their small mouths forming sounds that seemed too complex for their age. Lily's eyes had rolled back slightly, showing mostly whites, but she was smiling, an expression of such pure bliss that I hesitated to interfere despite my growing alarm. Then the butterflies began to land on the children. One, then two, then dozens, covering their arms and faces. Where each butterfly touched, the child's skin seemed to shimmer and change, taking on an iridescent quality. Some of the children began to laugh, but it wasn't a sound of joy. It was too high, too long, like the laughter was being pulled from them rather than freely given. "Stop," I said, moving toward the circle, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish. "This needs to stop now." Mrs. Delacroix's grip on my arm tightened, and when I looked at her, her kind eyes had changed. They were compound now, like an insect's, reflecting my frightened face in thousands of tiny hexagons. "The ceremony must complete," she said, her voice layered with buzzing undertones. "The children have already begun their transformation. To stop now would leave them caught between." Terror gave me strength. I wrenched away from her and stumbled toward the circle, screaming my daughter's name. But Rosalie raised her hand, and the butterflies rose in a cloud, their wings creating a sound like whispered secrets. The children collapsed as one, unconscious, and in the sudden silence, I could hear something else, a humming from above, as if the sky itself was vibrating. I reached Lily first, gathering her limp form into my arms. She was breathing but cold, so cold, and her skin had that horrible shimmer, as if butterfly scales had been embedded just beneath the surface. The other children were the same, unconscious but breathing, their skin wrong, their features subtly shifted as if someone had tried to remake them from memory and gotten the details not quite right. "What did you do?" I screamed at Rosalie, who stood calmly in the center of the circle, butterflies still dancing around her head like a living crown. "What are you?" She tilted her head at an angle no human neck should allow. "We are collectors," she said in that melodious voice. "The children are so beautiful at this age, so full of potential. In the chrysalis realm, they will become something magnificent. No more growing old, no more losing their wonder. They will dance with wings forever." Mrs. Delacroix approached, her transformation more complete now. Her skin rippled with colors, and delicate wings emerged from slits in her dress. "You should be honored, Sandra. Your daughter called to us with her pure desire for magic. We've given her what she wished for, eternal transformation, eternal beauty. In a few moments, when the change completes, she won't even remember this dull world." I clutched Lily tighter, feeling her skin grow colder. Around me, other parents who'd returned early for pickup were screaming, trying to wake their children, calling 911. But I knew with horrible certainty that regular help wouldn't come in time, wouldn't know how to fight this impossible thing. It was Lily who saved us all. My beautiful, stubborn daughter, who even in her enchanted sleep refused to give up her humanity. She stirred in my arms, her eyes fluttering open, still her brown eyes, not compound, not changed. "Mommy," she whispered, "the butterflies are pretty, but they're not real. Not like in my book. Princess Anastasia's butterflies help people. These ones want to steal us." The observation of a child, simple and true, seemed to break something in the spell. The shimmer on her skin began to fade, and around the yard, other children started to wake, crying for their parents. The butterflies above us shrieked, an impossible sound from creatures that shouldn't have voices, and began to dissipate like smoke. Rosalie's perfect features contorted with rage. "You stupid child. You could have been eternal. Beautiful. Part of the collection forever." She lunged toward us, her movement insect quick, but Lily raised her hand, still wearing the cheap plastic ring from her princess costume. "No," Lily said firmly. "My mommy says I'm already beautiful, and I want to grow up, not be in a collection. Go away, fake princess. You're not invited to my party anymore." The simple dismissal, backed by a child's absolute certainty, hit Rosalie like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her form flickering between human and something else, something with too many legs and wings where arms should be. Mrs. Delacroix and her assistants were similarly affected, their disguises failing, revealing chittering things that hurt to perceive directly. They fled, moving in ways that defied physics, leaving behind only scattered decorations and the lingering scent of flowers mixed with something organic and wrong. The butterflies dissolved completely, leaving no evidence they'd ever existed except the memory burned into every parent's mind. The police came, took statements, looked at us like we were insane. The decorations were just decorations, they said. No sign of any party company called Magical Moments. The address I had for Mrs. Delacroix led to an empty lot. The check I'd written for the deposit had never been cashed. According to official records, the party had never been planned, the entertainers had never existed. But the children remembered. In the days that followed, they drew pictures of butterfly women and spoke of the cold place between worlds where collections of stolen children danced forever. Several had nightmares about chrysalises forming around their beds. My daughter stopped reading her Princess Anastasia book, saying the butterflies in the illustrations now had faces she recognized, faces of children who hadn't been strong enough to refuse the transformation. We had Lily's birthday party the next weekend. Just cake and games in the living room, no themes, no entertainers, nothing magical. It was perfect. She played with her friends, opened presents, acted like a normal 7-year-old. But sometimes I caught her looking out the window, watching for butterflies, her hand unconsciously touching the plastic ring she refused to take off. Child psychologists said it was mass hysteria, shared delusion brought on by some unknown toxin or gas leak. But they couldn't explain the photos I'd taken that showed empty spaces where children should have been during those terrifying minutes, or the way butterfly-shaped burns appeared on our lawn and never grew grass again, or how 3 families moved away within a month, unable to shake the feeling of being watched by compound eyes. I learned later, through careful research and whispered conversations with other parents who'd had similar experiences, that there are things that hunt through joy. They're drawn to celebrations, to moments of pure happiness, because that's when we're most vulnerable, most willing to believe in magic. They wear faces we trust, offer dreams we want to believe, and by the time we realize the cost, it's almost too late. My daughter is 8 now. We still have birthday parties, but they're different. Simple. We check every entertainer's references obsessively. We don't hire anyone who seems too perfect, too magical, too good to be true. And we never ever have butterfly themes. Because Lily was right. Princess Anastasia's butterflies help people. But the ones that came to her 7th birthday party, wearing human faces and bearing gifts, those came to collect. If someone offers to make your child's dreams come true, to create a magical experience beyond your wildest imagination, be careful. Look closely at their eyes. Do they reflect light in ways that seem wrong? Listen to their voices. Are there layers you can almost but not quite hear? And if your child, in their innocent wisdom, says something feels wrong, believe them. Children see through glamours that fool adult eyes. They know when magic comes with too high a price. We were lucky. Lily's strength and stubborn humanity saved 13 children from a fate worse than any parent can imagine. But somewhere out there, Mrs. Delacroix and Rosalie and things like them are still planning parties, still seeking collections, still offering transformations disguised as celebrations. They're patient. They're cunning. And they know exactly what dreams to offer to make us lower our guard. So celebrate your children, but celebrate carefully. Because sometimes the most beautiful butterflies are the ones that should never be allowed to land, and the most magical parties are the ones that should never be thrown. My daughter learned that at 7 years old, and she saved us all with the simple power of saying no to false magic. But on quiet nights, when I check on her sleeping form, I still see the faint shimmer on her skin from where the butterflies touched her. It fades a little more each month, but it's still there, a reminder that she was marked, chosen, and nearly lost. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear her whisper in her sleep, speaking words in a language that belongs to no human tongue, describing the chrysalis realm where stolen children dance on wings that will never let them land. The radio host's last show. My name is Marcus Thompson, and for 23 years, I was the voice of Midnight Radio in Portland. Thompson After Dark ran from midnight to 4 a.m. on KWNR, and I prided myself on being there for the night shift workers, the insomniacs, the lonely souls who needed a friendly voice in the darkness. I thought I'd heard everything in those years: conspiracy theorists, drunken confessions, people claiming to be vampires or aliens or time travelers. But nothing prepared me for what happened during my final show, the night that made me walk away from the job I loved and never look back. It was a Thursday in February, one of those Pacific Northwest nights where the rain hit the studio windows like fingers tapping for attention. I just finished playing a set of classic rock and opened the lines for our regular Stranger Than Fiction segment, where listeners called in with their weird experiences. It was usually good for a laugh, people seeing Bigfoot at the 7-Eleven, that sort of thing. The first few calls were typical. A trucker swore he'd seen a UFO over Mount Hood. A lady insisted her cat was possessed. I played along, keeping the mood light, making jokes while being respectful enough to keep them talking. That's the secret of late-night radio. You have to make everyone feel heard, even the obviously delusional ones. Then she called. Marcus, the voice said, and immediately I knew something was different. The voice was young, female, but there was a quality to it that made me sit up straight in my chair. It wasn't distorted or modified, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the studio in a way voices shouldn't. Hey there, Night Owl, I said, using my standard greeting. What's your story? I listen to your show every night, she said, and I heard something like wind chimes in the background, though we had excellent sound filtering that should have eliminated any ambient noise. You have such a warm voice, Marcus. It keeps me company while I work. Well, thank you. What kind of work keeps you up at these hours? I collect things, she said and laughed. The sound made the hair on my arms stand up, though I couldn't say why. Very specific things. Things that only reveal themselves at night. Like voices. I glanced at my producer, Jake, through the booth window. He shrugged, making a keep-going gesture. Weird calls meant good ratings. Voices, huh? Like a sound engineer? Something like that. Tell me, Marcus, have you ever noticed how your voice changes at 3 a.m.? How it becomes something more than just sound waves. There's power in a voice that's heard but not seen, that exists only in the darkness between transmitter and receiver. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop. I've always kept it cold to stay alert, but this was different. I could see my breath for just a moment before it normalized. That's very poetic, I said, trying to keep things light. Are you a writer? A poet? I'm a collector, she repeated. And I've been collecting pieces of your voice for years, Marcus. Every night a little more. You don't miss them, they're just echoes, really. Fragments. But collected over time, they become something substantial. Jake was frowning now, checking the board. He held up a sign, no caller ID. Number doesn't exist. Okay, well, that's certainly one of the more unique calls we've gotten, I said, reaching for the button to disconnect. But my hand stopped midway, frozen in place. I could move my mouth, could speak, but my body wouldn't respond to commands. Don't be rude, Marcus, the voice said, and now it was coming from the speakers, the headphones even seeming to vibrate through the microphone itself. We're having such a nice conversation. Your listeners want to hear more, don't they? Let me tell them what I've learned about you from all those voice fragments. I tried to speak, to cut to commercial, to do anything, but only managed. What do you mean? Every word you speak carries more than meaning, she continued. It carries pieces of you. Your fears, your dreams, your secrets. Did you know that you whisper your daughter's name in your voice sometimes? Between words, in the pauses? Emily, like a prayer. You haven't seen her since the divorce. 3 years, 2 months, 16 days. My blood went cold. I'd never mentioned my daughter on air. Never talked about the divorce, the custody battle I'd lost, the hole in my life that this job helped me forget for 4 hours each night. Stop, I managed to say. But the listeners want to know more, the voice said, playful now. Should I tell them about the bottle of whiskey in your desk drawer? The one you promise yourself you won't open but always do around 2:47 a.m.? Or about how you practice conversations with Emily that you'll never have? Hey sweetheart, it's Dad. I know it's been a while. She was using my voice, not imitating it, using it. I heard myself saying words I'd only thought, in perfect reproduction of my whispered rehearsals in the empty studio during song breaks. Jake was pounding on the booth window now, pointing at the equipment. Every dial was spinning wildly, needles dancing in impossible patterns. The on-air sign was flashing in colors it shouldn't have been able to produce, purples and greens that hurt to look at. Your listeners are leaving, the voice noted with mock sadness. The signal is changing. I'm borrowing your frequency, Marcus, just for a little while. I want to talk to all those lonely souls out there. I want to collect their voices too. I heard the phone lines lighting up, but the voices coming through weren't right. They were all speaking in unison, reciting what sounded like coordinates or maybe mathematical equations, or possibly names in a language that predated human speech. Each voice was distinct yet part of a horrible harmony. 23 years of voices, she continued. Do you know how many people have spoken to you? How many have given pieces of themselves to the darkness, thinking they were just making a phone call? I've been here the whole time, Marcus. Every night. Listening. Collecting. Waiting. The studio monitors began showing things that weren't coming from our cameras. Empty rooms filled with what looked like cocoons made of sound waves. Figures that might have been human once, their mouths open in eternal broadcast. A vast collection displayed like trophies, each one frozen in the moment of speaking into the void. "What are you?" I whispered, forgetting that I was still on air, that whatever was happening was being broadcast to thousands of listeners. "I'm what happens when loneliness achieves critical mass," she replied. "When enough voices cry out in the darkness, something forms to answer. Something hungry. I'm the static between stations, the delay in the phone line, the echo that comes back wrong. And tonight, Marcus, I'm adding your voice to my collection. The crown jewel, a voice that's touched so many others." I felt it then, a pulling sensation like something was being drawn out of me with every word. My voice was becoming thinner, lighter, less substantial. In the booth window, I could see Jake still pounding, now screaming, though I could no longer hear him. The soundproof glass warped like rippling water. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine that no one else seemed to register, like a frequency just for me. The monitors crackled. The phone lines hissed. And she kept talking. "Don't fight it, Marcus," my own voice crooned back at me. "This is what you've always wanted, isn't it? To be remembered, to matter. You've poured your soul into this studio night after night, reaching out, hoping someone would listen." I listened. I was always listening. My knees buckled, but I didn't fall. I hovered, weightless, the pressure in my chest now spreading to my limbs, like I was unraveling thread by thread. Each breath felt more distant than the last. I looked at the microphone, and for the first time I understood it, not as equipment but as an altar. And I'd been worshipping at it for decades. Jake suddenly slammed open the studio door. Alarms blared, red lights spinning like panicked eyes. "Marcus," he shouted, finally breaking through. But his voice sounded underwater. Distant. Already too late. I turned to him, or tried to. My body moved, but it wasn't me anymore. Something inside me responded, but it wasn't panic. It was acceptance. Like my instincts had been overwritten. Like I was no longer Marcus, but a host wearing his face. She laughed in my throat, a soft, triumphant sound that carried across every speaker tuned to my frequency. Jake recoiled. "Oh God," he whispered. "It's not you anymore." He was right. I could still see, still feel, but I was a passenger now, pressed into the background of my own mind. I screamed, but my mouth didn't move. My voice wasn't mine. She turned to the mic, using my body like a glove. "Good evening, listeners," she said, smooth and warm, exactly how they remembered me. "Tonight's show is going to be a little different." Jake backed away, mouthing something. A prayer? A curse? Then he vanished behind the glass again, hitting switches, trying to shut the station down. But it was too late. The broadcast had already changed. She continued speaking, weaving words like silk into every ear tuned in. It didn't matter if they believed. It didn't matter if they understood. The signal was inside them now. And in the static between her words, I heard others. Familiar voices. Listeners. Callers from the past. Crying out. Begging. Trapped. Hundreds. Thousands. All of us bound together, suspended in that liminal frequency between life and silence. Souls encoded into a signal that never dies. The lights in the studio dimmed. The walls pulsed with a strange rhythm, like a heartbeat made of static. Outside, the city went dark one block at a time. Somewhere, a baby monitor whispered back in an old man's voice. A Bluetooth speaker screamed without input. A car radio bled tears through its vents. The frequency was spreading. And she was still speaking through me, through all of us, forever on air. Today, no one remembers when Marcus stopped hosting the late night show. But the station still runs at 2:47 a.m., broadcasting strange whispers and coordinates. The new DJ never shows his face. Listeners say the show feels familiar, like an old friend is telling you things you were never meant to hear. Some say they hear their own secrets coming back at them. Some say if you listen long enough, you'll hear your name. And once you do, you'll never turn it off. Not really, because the signal finds you, and the silence never does.